The strong drink. The weak wait and die. Such is the order in this cage on wheels. And into it they throw a man who, in his past life, perished beneath the wheels of a truck. And now he looks at the chain, at the water, at the guards, and he counts. The first thing to strike is the stench in his nose, the sour, heavy reek of unwashed bodies, rotting hay, and urine. It turns Kalen's stomach. Then comes the pain. His back aches. His wrists are cut raw. His whole body is jolted at every bump, and the iron bites into his skin. He opens his eyes. Bars before his face. Wrought iron a finger thick. Beyond them, a gray sky and steppe stretching to the horizon. He is in a cage on wheels. Around him, 15 more people. Gaunt, filthy, beaten. All of them threaded through by a single long chain running through rings on their wrists. Outside ride 2 horsemen in skins, carrying spears. They don't even glance at the cage. Kalen wiggles his fingers and freezes. These are not his fingers. Thin, with a teenager's calluses. He raises a hand to his face. A different nose, different cheekbones, a stranger's chin. His heart beats once, twice, 3 times. He forces himself to breathe evenly. The smell is real. The pain is real. The chain is real. So this is not a dream, and not a dying delirium. He remembers everything. The roadside, the woman with the blown tire, the headlights of the truck, the impact. And then this cage. And whatever this is, it is real. In his head, fragments that are not his flare up. The name Kalen, a burning village, an axe sinking into his father's chest, his mother on her knees before horsemen, hands tearing him by the hair, a chain, darkness. The boy was 17, now Kalen is 17. He sweeps his gaze around the cage. First rule, don't panic. Second, assess the situation. Third, find your own. He counts. 15 people. 4 big men, but worn down by hunger. 6 of middling build, beaten. 3 women. An old man burning with fever. And a red-haired girl of about 19 who stares at a single point without blinking. She does not weep. Kalen notes this. Whoever does not weep in a cage is either broken all the way through or still dangerous. He reads the guards, 2 of them, spears long, made for mounted combat. No bows, no swords, short knives at their belts. The horses unshod. The cage sits on a cart, wheels with iron rims. 2 oxen pull it. Ahead, a cart with supplies. Behind it, a third rider, larger than the guards. He wears a hide set with bone plaques. Bone plaques means status. This is not a simple guard, the caravan master. Kalen tests the chain. The links are thick but rusted. The locks are pin locks, no springs. Such a lock opens with a nail or a sliver if you know how. He knows how, but not now. Right now there are 2 men with spears and 1 with plaques, and step in every direction. Nowhere to run. 15 exhausted men in chains will not escape mounted riders. So not now. He closes his eyes and listens. The language is foreign, but he understands it. The guards are talking. One complains about the heat. The second lets slip that it's still 3 days to the encampment. Kalen memorizes it. They're not taking them to a market, but to someone. The first says that Chief Urga ordered at least 12 brought alive. If more than 3 die, the overseer gets an ear cut off. The second laughs. Last time 5 died and they cut off both. Kalen looks at the old man. He's wheezing. His face is gray. His lips cracked. Without water, he won't last 2 days. Kalen turns to the big man on his right. About 40. Broad shoulders, even withered. Calluses on his hands. Not a peasant. A soldier. Even in chains, even worn down, he holds his back straight. Army habit. Kaylin memorizes him. Next, the redhead. On the inside of her forearm, a long, narrow callus from a bowstring. An archer. Her he memorizes too. The sun crawls toward the horizon. No water is given. No food is given. One of the men groans and begs for a drink. A guard strikes the bars with the butt of his spear. The man falls silent. The old man loses consciousness and topples to the floor. The chain tears at the wrists of 3. Someone curses and kicks the old man. Kaylin does not move. He watches. He counts. By evening, the caravan halts. The guards build a fire. The master drinks from a wineskin in long, greedy gulps. 30 eyes follow him. No one asks. Everyone already understands it's useless. An hour later, the master passes another wineskin into the cage. 1 for 15. The big man at the door grabs it first. 5 gulps and he passes it to his neighbor. The water goes around the circle and runs out on the 8th. 7 get nothing. Among them, the old man. Among them, the redhead. Among them, Kaylin. No one protests. The strong drink. The weak wait. Kaylin lies on his side, face toward the bars. But he does not sleep. He thinks. 3 days to the encampment. 1 wineskin a day. The water is enough for 8. In 3 days, half will arrive half dead. The old man won't last until tomorrow. That leaves 14. And if the strong start drinking more, 10 will make it. Maybe 9. Ergo wants 12. So the overseer knows this too, and will intervene. Or not. Kaylin thinks further. What he needs is not muscle, but people. Those who will listen. Not because he is stronger, but because his words will keep them alive. On the morning of the 2nd day, the old man is still alive. Barely. Wheezing and raving. Everyone shifts away. Disease. No one wants to catch it. By noon, the master flings in a half-rotten loaf. 1 for 15. And the cage explodes. The 4 big men lunge at the bread all at once. The chain rattles. Someone shouts. One sinks his teeth into the loaf with both hands. A second elbows him in the jaw. A third snatches the bread in midair. A sharpened sliver comes into play. Blood sprays onto a forearm. The sliver splits a cheek. The redhead presses into the bars and covers her head. The guards don't even turn around. They see this every day. Kaylin sits by the far wall and watches. A minute. 2. The big man ends up on top, tears at the loaf with his teeth, stuffs his mouth. 2 of his allies get a handful each. The rest get nothing. And on the floor, in the dirt, lies a small crust. It flew off in the scuffle and no one noticed. Kaylin slowly picks it up. He turns to the old man. He sets the crust down before his face. The big man sees this. He stops chewing. He fixes Kaylin with a stare. For several seconds, they look at each other. Kaylin does not look away. Then he speaks, quietly, in broken speech that the body remembers better than the mind. Tomorrow, the old man will fall. He has a fever. He'll have to be carried. And if you don't carry him, the overseer will finish him off. And then 13 reach the encampment, not 14. Urga asked for 12 alive. So every living one is insurance for the rest. The old man is needed alive. Not out of pity, but because every dead one raises the chance that the overseer starts cutting up those who still breathe. The big man listens. His jaws go still. Kaylin presses on. He knows how far it is to the well. 2 days. He knows who will make it and who won't, with water rationed this way. Drink by the right of strength. And 9 arrive. Maybe 8. And the overseer gets both ears cut off. And before that, he'll cut something off those still alive. Because an angry man with a knife always looks for someone to take his anger out on. The big man spits out the crust. He asks who Kaylin is to give orders. Kaylin answers that he's nobody, just a man who knows how to count. And the count says, divide the water into 15 parts, and all survive. Don't divide it, and not all survive. And he asks the big man whether he wants to be one of those who didn't survive. The big man is silent. But that evening, when the master tosses in the wineskin, he does not drink first. He looks at Kalen. Kalen takes the wineskin, measures out 1 swallow. 1. Passes it on, drops a single word. Swallow. The man drinks 1 swallow and passes it on. The wineskin goes the whole circle. All 15 get water. A little remains at the bottom. Kalen pours the rest into the old man, drop by drop. The old man opens cloudy, inflamed eyes. He tries to say something. Kalen lays a hand on his shoulder. Be quiet. Save your strength. By the evening of the second day, Kalen has 5 people. The big man, whose name is Goran, 2 of the middling men who saw how his arithmetic with the water worked, a woman named Myra who helped turn the old man onto his side so he wouldn't choke, and that soldier with the army back. His name is Marcus. In 2 days, he has not said a single word to Kalen. But when the water was divided, Marcus was the first to hold out his swallow to the old man and took the last for himself. Kalen doesn't need it explained what that means. A soldier recognizes order when he sees it. The redhead still says nothing. She drinks her swallow and turns away. But Kalen notices. She no longer stares at a single point. Now she looks at him. On the 3rd day, the old man dies. Quietly, before dawn. He simply stops breathing. Kalen closes his eyes. Now there are 14 of them. The overseer peers into the cage, counts, spits, but doesn't come in to beat anyone. 14 is more than 12. For now, it's enough. The caravan crawls onward. By noon, hills rise on the horizon, gray, low, in coarse grass and scattered trees. The Bone Hills. Somewhere out there is the encampment of a chief named Urga the Crooked. Somewhere out there, the next stage will begin. In the cage, Kalen did everything he could. Now he needs ground under his feet. To see the camp, to count the warriors, to find weak points, to find tools, to find those who can be taught. He needs time. He turns to Marcus and quietly drops, "When we arrive, don't show that you're a soldier. Hobble, stoop, look broken." Marcus looks at him a long while, asks why. Kalen answers, "At the sorting, the first to be killed are those who look dangerous. Warriors are slaughtered or sent to the arena. The weak are sent to labor. At labor, there are tools. At the arena, there is only death." Marcus is silent for 10 heartbeats. Then he nods. By the evening of the 3rd day, the caravan rolls into the encampment of Urga the Crooked. The encampment of Urga the Crooked was larger than Kalen had expected. About 40 tents of hides stretched over wooden frames. In the center stood the largest tent, decorated with animal skulls and strips of dyed cloth. Warriors moved around it. Kalen counted as the cage was dragged along the main path past the tents. 60 armed men, maybe 70. Spears and axes, few bows, fewer swords still. Iron was a rarity here. Most spearheads were of bone or stone. This he noted too. Behind the tents stood pens for livestock, sheep and goats. He counted about 30 horses. Farther, beyond the pens, were low, long structures of poles and clay. Barracks. Slave barracks. They reeked of the same smell as the cage, only worse. The cage was stopped by the main tent. The overseer, with the bone plaques, dismounted and went inside. After a few minutes, he came out together with a man Kalen could not tear his eyes from. Urga the Crooked was short of stature, stocky, with a broad chest and short, powerful legs. His left eye was closed by the scar of an old burn. The scar ran from his temple across his whole cheek to his chin. His right eye was small, dark, and very quick. It moved fast as a bird's, jumping from object to object. Urga came up to the cage and began inspecting the captives. He walked along the bars and jabbed each one in the shoulder or side with the end of his whip. He stopped at Goran, assessed his shoulders, nodded, moved on. He stopped at one of the middling men. The man tried to shift away. Urga struck him across the face with the whip. Not hard, a test. The man cringed. Urga moved on. He reached Marcus. Marcus stood hunched, head down, shoulders forward, arms hanging like dead weight. He looked like a broken old man, not a soldier. Kalen held his breath. Urga looked at Marcus for 3 seconds, then passed by. Kalen wanted to exhale, but did not allow himself. Too soon. Urga reached him. The small dark eye fixed on Kalen from below. Urga said this one was thin as a stick. The overseer answered that at least he was young, tough. Urga grunted and moved on. The redhead he inspected longer than the others. His eye slid over her body from top to bottom. He said something to the overseer, quietly. The overseer smirked. Kalen didn't catch the words, but understood from the tone. His fingers under the chain clenched. He forced them to unclench. Not now. An hour later, they were let out of the cage, one by one. Each was inspected by 2 warriors with spears. They checked teeth, kneaded shoulders, made them squat and stand. Those who couldn't stand were dragged aside. 2 were dragged off, one of the middling men and a woman with a bad leg, who had stayed silent the whole way. Kalen didn't see where they were taken, but he heard a short scream a few minutes later. Only one. The remaining 12 were distributed among the barracks. Kalen and Marcus were assigned to the 3rd barracks, Goran to the 1st, Myra to the 2nd. The redhead was led off separately toward the main tent. Kalen saw her walk between 2 warriors. Her back was straight. She did not look back. The barracks was long and low, an earthen floor covered with rotting straw. Along the walls, wooden bunks in 2 tiers. About 30 people were already in the barracks, slaves. Some had been here a long time, judging by how they moved. Slowly, by habit, without wasted motion. They knew where to lie and when to be silent, and where not to look. The newcomers were met with empty stares. Marcus sat on the lower bunks by the wall and leaned his back against the poles. Kalen sat beside him. They were silent until the barracks quieted, and most fell asleep. Then Marcus spoke, quietly, with only his lips. He said he was a former sergeant of the 3rd Foot Company of Alderaan, taken captive 2 years ago during a border skirmish. His company was wiped out. He was taken alive because sergeants fetch more than rank and file at market. Kalen listened. Marcus said this encampment held about 120 slaves. He had already asked his bunk neighbor. There were 3 kinds of labor. The mine, 2 hours' walk to the east. There they dug some kind of yellow stone, half come back from it. The stockyard, easier there, but they feed you worse. And the forge. Kalen lifted his head. The forge. Marcus nodded. Urga was one of the few chiefs who had his own smith, a slave woman from a southern kingdom. She'd been brought a year and a half ago. She forged spearheads and repaired tools. 2 slave helpers were assigned to her. Kalen asked how to get into the forge. Marcus said there was no way. They picked those who knew how to work metal. The rest went to the mine or the stockyard. Kalen thought a minute, then asked what would happen in the morning. Marcus answered that in the morning, the distributor would come, a senior slave appointed by Urga. He decides who goes where. For a bribe, you can get the stockyard. Without a bribe, the mine. Kalen asked what to pay with. Marcus smirked. With whatever you have. Food, clothing, services, information. Slavery has its own economy. Kalen nodded. He had none of those things. But he had something else. He knew things no one in this world knew. In the morning, the distributor came. A large slave with the encampment's mark tattooed on his cheek. His name was Borg. He walked along the barracks, jabbing a finger at newcomers. You to the mine. You to the mine. You to the stockyard. When he reached Kalen, Kalen spoke first, quietly and evenly. He told Borg he knew how to heal wounds. Borg stopped, looked him up and down, asked where a brat learned to heal. Kalen answered that his mother had been an herbalist in the village. It was a lie, but the body's memory told him there were enough herbs in this world and that no shaman would heal a slave. So wounded slaves either recovered on their own or died, and a dead slave is a loss. Borg thought for a second, then said the encampment had no need of a healer. To the mine. Kalen did not budge. He said 3 slaves in the first barracks had festering wounds on their legs. He'd seen them yesterday when they were led past. If not treated, in a week, fever would set in. 3 would be lost. Borg narrowed his eyes. He knew about those 3. Kalen added that he needed only hot water and clean cloth. And 1 night. Borg was silent for 5 heartbeats. Then said, "Fine, let the brat show what he can do." If those 3 didn't die by morning, he stayed at the barracks. If they died, the brat went to the mine for double the term. Kalen nodded. That night, he treated the wounds of the 3 slaves from the first barracks. He had nothing but boiled water, which he begged from a kitchen slave in exchange for a promise to heal his bad knee, and strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. He washed the wounds with hot water, cleaned out the pus, bandaged them with clean cloth. 2 improved by morning. The 3rd was too far gone, but the fever broke. Borg came to check, looked, grunted, said the brat stayed at the barracks. So Kalen gained freedom of movement among the 3 barracks. That was more than any new slave got on the first day. He could walk from barracks to barracks. He could talk to people. He could observe. In the first week, he went through all 3 barracks and counted everyone. 117 slaves. Of them, about 20 were in any condition to hold a stick. The rest were too emaciated or too broken. He found Goran in the first barracks. He'd been sent to the stockyard. Kalen asked him to count the warriors he saw each day at the pasture. Goran nodded. Myra was assigned to the second barracks for kitchen work. Kalen asked her to remember when the warriors were fed and how much food went out. She looked at him strangely, but agreed. Marcus was sent to the mine. That was bad. The mine killed fast. Kalen went to Borg and said Marcus was needed as a helper for carrying the wounded. Borg refused. Kalen said that at the mine yesterday, 2 men fell and broke their bones. They were carried out by 4 healthy men. 4 healthy men who didn't work for half a day. If the barracks had a helper to treat minor wounds on the spot before the shift, the slaves wouldn't fall so often. Borg listened. This was a language he understood. Slaves are a resource. A dead slave is a loss. A healed slave is a working unit. Borg gave Kalen Marcus. Now they were together, and they could talk every day. Kalen began the very first night. He found a long, thin nail in the barracks floor, pried it out, and the first thing he did was not pick the locks. He began to tap. On the barracks post. 3 short, 3 long. 3 short. Morse code. Marcus didn't understand.
Kalen explained.
Not Morse code, of course. He said it was a system of signals. Each sequence of taps means a word or a letter. He would tap on the post in the evening. In the first barracks, there was a post that rested against the same beam as the post of the second barracks. A tap on one post is heard in the other. If a man in the first barracks knows the system, he'll understand the message. Marcus looked at him a long while, then asked where a village boy learned such things. Kalen answered that his mother had taught him many things. Marcus didn't believe him. Kalen saw it in his eyes. But Marcus didn't ask further. Within a week, 3 men in 3 barracks could receive and transmit 12 simple signals: alarm, quiet, gather, water, food, weapons, wait, move, yes, no, erga, danger. It was a beginning. The redhead Kalen saw only 10 days later. She was brought back to the barracks quietly at night. She walked on her own. Her face was calm. Too calm. She lay on the bunk and turned to the wall. Kalen did not approach, did not ask. In the morning, he set his portion of morning gruel beside her bunk. A small bowl of thin gray gruel given to slaves once a day. She did not take it. Kalen left. The next morning, he again left his portion. The ravine lay a quarter-hour's walk beyond the eastern edge of the encampment. Between the stockyard and the start of the trail to the mine ran a strip of low brush that Urga's warriors did not patrol. Beyond it, the ground dropped away sharply. The ravine was shallow, about 3 meters, but wide enough that 20 men could stand in it. The slopes were grown over with coarse grass. The bottom was dry. From the encampment side, the ravine could not be seen, hidden by the crest of the hill. From the mine side, it was screened by brush. Kalen found it when he went for water at the stream. He was coming back with 2 wineskins for the barracks and saw the dip in the ground. Climbed down, looked it over, walked it end to end. Checked the sightlines from every side. A good place. The training began on the 16th day, the first night. 4 men, Kalen, Marcus, Goran, and 1 more. A man from the second barracks named Theo. Theo was short and thin, about 25, a former peasant from near Alderan. His wife and daughter had been killed in a raid. He'd been sold. He'd been here 9 months. Kalen chose him not for strength. Theo had no strength. He chose him for his eyes. Theo looked at the world as if he were already dead. But he did everything he was told, precisely and without question. He didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't refuse. He just did. Kalen had seen such men before. In another life, men who had lost everything and had nothing to lose. They either became the best soldiers or at some point lay down and didn't get up. Theo could become either. The first training was simple. Kalen gave each man a stick the length of a man's height. Ordinary sticks gathered at the brush. He showed how to hold it. Both hands, left lower, right higher. Elbows tucked. Weight on the back foot. The stick before you at an angle. They stood in the ravine in the dark. The moon gave enough light to see silhouettes. Kalen commanded, "Step forward." The 4 stepped. Not at the same time. Marcus a fraction of a second early. Goran later. Theo almost together with Kalen. Kalen stopped them. Explained. The step must be simultaneous. Left foot forward, all together, on his signal. The signal was a short whistle. They repeated. Again, not at the same time. Repeated again, and again, and again. On the 20th try, it worked. 4 feet struck the ground as one. Kalen nodded. Again. They repeated the forward step until Goran's knees began to tremble with fatigue. Then Kalen showed the second movement. Step back. Right foot back. The stick stays in front. Whistle. Step. Whistle. Step. They drilled 2 movements for 2 hours. Step forward and step back. At the end, Marcus sat on the ground and looked at Kalen. He said that in the Alderan infantry, the formation was taught for a month, not 2 movements, the whole formation. Kalen answered that the Alderan infantry was 3,000 men who marched across a flat field against other infantry. They didn't have 3,000. They had 4. And they didn't need to march. They needed to move at the same time. That was different. Marcus said nothing. But the next day, he came first. On the 3rd night, Kalen brought 4 more. Now there were 8. He split them into 2 groups of 4. Triples were too soon. First, 4s. Each 4 stood in a line shoulder to shoulder, sticks in front. Whistle. Step forward. Whistle. Step forward. Whistle. Stop. Whistle. Step back. They moved in the dark like the blind, stumbling, getting tangled. One stepped on another's foot. Goran swore and got an elbow from Marcus. Kalen stopped them. He said that in formation, there are no voices. There is the whistle, there is the step, there is silence. Whoever speaks without permission steps out of the line. Goran looked at him angrily, but said nothing. By the end of the first week of night training, 8 men could take 10 steps forward at the same time. Not perfectly, but at the same time. That was more than any of Urga's warriors had ever seen from slaves. In the second week, Kalen added the 3rd movement, the thrust. Stick forward at chest height. The right hand pushes, the left guides. Hips forward, weight shifts to the front foot. It was the simplest spear thrust, taught in any army on the first day. But here, it was a revelation. Urga's warriors fought each man for himself. They threw themselves at the enemy with a cry and hacked with axes. Each chose his own target. Each struck as he pleased. There was no formation, no coordination. Kalen explained a simple thing to his 8. 1 thrust means nothing. 8 thrusts at the same time is a wall of iron that can't be passed. It doesn't matter that each of them is weaker than any of Urga's warriors. What matters is that 8 sticks striking at the same time will stop even 10 warriors. Because 10 warriors run helter-skelter, and 8 sticks strike as 1. Marcus listened to this, and on his face, Kalen saw for the first time something like understanding. Not just obedience. Understanding. A sergeant who had served 20 years in an army where formation was a formality heard from a 17-year-old boy a thing that overturned everything he knew about combat. Formation isn't a parade. Formation is a weapon. In the middle of the 3rd week, the thing Kalen had been waiting for and dreading happened. Theo did not come to night training. Kalen found him in the barracks. Theo lay on the bunk facing the wall. He wasn't sleeping. He was just lying there. Kalen sat beside him, was silent a long while, then asked what had happened. Theo did not answer. Kalen waited, then asked again. Theo said he saw no point. He said they would all die, sooner or later, at the mine, at the arena, in battle. What difference did it make when? He said he was tired of pretending tomorrow would be better. It wouldn't be. It never would be. Kalen sat beside him and listened. He did not say Theo was wrong. He did not promise everything would be all right. He said one thing. He said that tomorrow, during the day, Theo would carry water from the stream. And while he carried the water, let him look at the sky. Theo turned his head and looked at Kalen. His eyes were empty. He asked, why look at the sky? Kalen answered that he didn't know. Just let him look. Theo turned back to the wall. The next night, he came to training. He said not a word. He took his place in the line, did his 10 steps, his 10 thrusts, and went back to the barracks. Kalen did not ask whether he'd looked at the sky. By the end of the third week, Kalen began bringing men out in pairs, twos, two men who move together. One strikes, the other covers. One steps forward, the other holds the line. He paired Marcus with Goren, Theo with one of the newcomers named Ren. He himself stood with a fifth. He showed how a pair works. The first man makes the thrust. The second man steps forward and closes the first one's flank. The first falls back half a step. The second makes the thrust. The first covers. A pendulum. Forward and back. Forward and back. They drilled this for 3 nights. On the 4th came the first breakthrough. Marcus and Goren moved in sync, without a whistle. Marcus struck and Goren stepped forward before Kalen gave the signal. He felt his partner's movement and reacted. Kalen stopped everyone, pointed at them, said that this was what formation was. When you don't need the whistle because you feel the man beside you. Marcus looked at Goren. Goren looked at Marcus. A former sergeant and a former peasant. They were both slaves. But in that moment, in that ravine, in the dark, they were something else. The training continued every night. There came to be more men. By the end of the first month at the encampment, Kalen had 20 men training in the ravine. 20 men who could stand in formation, take a step, and strike at the same time. 20 men who signaled to each other with whistles from reed pipes that Kalen taught them to make. 20 men who for the first time in years of slavery felt in their hands not a chain, but a stick. Kalen looked at them and knew it wasn't enough. Sticks aren't spears. A ravine isn't a battlefield. And 20 slaves aren't an army. He needed iron. He needed the forge. On the 30th day, he went to it. The forge stood on the western edge of the encampment, a canopy of hides over a stone hearth, an anvil, a barrel of water, tools on the wall, and a woman at the anvil. She was short and broad-shouldered, black hair gathered in a knot at the back of her head, forearms covered with old burns. She struck the hammer against a glowing piece of iron in even, measured blows. Beside her stood 2 slave helpers working the bellows. Kalen approached and stopped at a distance, waited in silence. The woman finished forging a spearhead, lowered it into the water, a hiss and steam. Then she turned to him. Her eyes were dark and attentive. She asked what he needed. Kalen said he had a wounded man in the 3rd barracks with an inflamed cut. He needed a clean knife to lance the abscess. The woman looked at him for 5 seconds, then silently held out a thin knife with a bone handle. Clean, sharpened. Kalen took it and thanked her, asked her name. She answered, Han Mi-suk. Kalen repeated the name, then asked how many spearheads she forged in a day. Mi-suk narrowed her eyes, asked why he wanted to know. Kalen answered that he was just counting. Mi-suk said 5 spearheads a day if the iron was good, 3 if it was bad. Kalen nodded and left with the knife. He came back the next day, brought the knife back, washed. He said the knife was good and the balance was right for fine work. Mi-suk looked at him differently than yesterday. She asked where a village boy learned what a knife's balance was. Kalen answered that his mother had taught him to butcher game. A good knife you feel in your hand, a bad one you don't. Mi-suk didn't believe him, like Marcus. But like Marcus, she didn't ask further. Kalen came to the forge every 2 days, brought water, helped pile coal, asked questions. How much iron was brought? From where? How often? Where it was stored? Mi-suk answered at first briefly, then in more detail. She was alone in this encampment. The 2 helpers were dull and good only for working the bellows. No one in the encampment understood what she did or valued her work. To Urga's warriors, she was a slave woman who banged a hammer. To Kalen, she was a master, and she felt it. By the end of the first month, Kalen knew everything he needed. The layout of the encampment, the number of warriors. The plan was simple. Simple plans survive contact with reality. Complex ones don't. Kalen had learned this in another life and had no intention of forgetting. 3 stages. First, neutralize the watch. Second, seize the weapons. Third, take Urga's tent. Everything else would follow. He laid out the plan to Marcus in the ravine 2 days before the appointed night. Marcus listened in silence, then asked one question. What if Urga wakes? Kalen answered that Urga wouldn't wake. Marcus asked how he knew. Kalen said Urga drank every evening, and by midnight couldn't stand on his feet. The kitchen slave Myra, who brought him milk, confirmed it, and Urga's wife, who hated him, confirmed it through Myra without knowing why she was being asked. Marcus nodded, then asked a second question. What to do with the slaves who weren't with them? 100 men who hadn't trained, who didn't know about the plan, who might cry out, raise a commotion, run the wrong way. Kalen said most slaves wouldn't get in the way. They would freeze. Slaves are conditioned not to move when violence happens around them. It's a survival reflex. They would lie on their bunks and wait until it was over. And when it was over, they would see that the masters were dead. And then the question wouldn't be whether they got in the way. The question would be whether they went with Kalen or left. Marcus was silent, then said Kalen didn't think like a boy. Kalen didn't answer. The day before the uprising, he went to Misuk. He came in the evening when the helpers had already gone to the barracks. Misuk sat by the cooled hearth, straightening a hammer. Kalen sat across from her, was silent a minute, then said that tomorrow night everything would change. Misuk stopped her work. She looked at him, and there was no surprise in her eyes. She said she'd known. Kalen asked how. She answered that the thin boy who comes to the forge every 2 days and asks how much iron is brought and where the weapons are kept is either a fool or planning something big. And Kalen didn't look like a fool. Kalen allowed himself a smirk, the first in a month. He asked whether she'd be with them. Misuk answered with a question. She asked what would become of the forge. Kalen said the forge would be hers, not Urga's, not a new master's, hers. And she'd forge not what she was ordered to, but what she judged necessary. Misuk looked at him for 10 heartbeats, then said she needed new bellows. The old ones had burned through. Kalen nodded and left. The night of the uprising. Moonless. Kalen had chosen it deliberately. For 3 nights he'd waited for just such a night. Clouds covered the sky from horizon to horizon. The darkness was total. An hour before midnight, Kalen gave the first signal. 3 short taps on the post. Gather. In 3 barracks, 20 men opened their eyes. They weren't sleeping. They were waiting. Kalen and Marcus left the 3rd barracks through a gap in the back wall they'd loosened over 10 nights. Outside, it was quiet. The encampment slept. Not a sound came from Urga's tent. Kalen whistled. 1 short whistle from the reed pipe. Out of the dark came Goran and 2 fighters from the 1st barracks. They carried sticks, not spears, sticks, sharpened at one end. Each sharpened 3 knights on a stone in the ravine. Not iron, but better than nothing. Kalen distributed the roles. Marcus and 2 take the eastern watch. Goran and 2 take the watch at the horses. Kalen goes to Urga's tent. With him, 1 man, Theo. Marcus objected. He said Kalen shouldn't go to the tent. If he were killed, everything would fall apart. Kalen answered that if he didn't go to the tent, his men wouldn't see that their commander risked himself alongside them. And the next time he asked someone to risk their life, that man would remember the commander had stood in safety. Marcus clenched his jaw, but nodded. They moved, quietly, without a sound, feet wrapped in rags so they wouldn't rustle through the grass. Kalen went toward Urga's tent along the line of livestock pens. Theo 2 steps behind him. Theo didn't tremble. Theo wasn't afraid. Kalen thought that a man who wants to die makes a strange but ideal soldier. He isn't afraid because he has nothing to lose, but he obeys because obedience is the last thing that gives him structure. Two sentries at Urga's tent sat by a small fire. One dozed, leaning against a post. The second sat clutching his spear and staring into the fire. Kalen froze in the shadow 10 paces from them, waited. The signal was to come from Marcus. Silence. A long silence. Then, from the eastern side of the encampment came a sound. A short, dull blow. And another. And silence. 5 seconds later, 3 short whistles. Marcus. The eastern watch was down. The sentry at the fire raised his head. He heard the whistle, but didn't understand it. Turned toward the sound. In that moment, Kalen moved. 5 quick steps. Sharpened stick forward. He struck the sentry in the side below the rib. The stick went in shallow. Wood isn't iron. The sentry cried out and tried to turn. Theo was faster. He leapt from the dark and struck the second sentry on the temple with his stick, the sleeping one. He didn't wake. The first sentry clutched his side and opened his mouth to scream. Kalen struck him with the base of the stick in the throat. The sentry wheezed and fell. Theo bore down on him from above and clamped his mouth shut. Kalen picked up the fallen sentry's spear, a real spear, with an iron head. His hand found the balance by habit. Kalen's body did not know how to hold a spear, but Dan Shaw did, and the muscle memory of the former owner yielded to the memory of the new soul. Out of the dark ran 4 more, his men from the second barracks. They'd come through the back wall as arranged. Kalen pointed at the tent. Without words, they knew what to do. 2 stood at the sides of the entrance. 2 went around to the rear. Kalen drew aside the flap and went inside. Darkness. The smell of sour milk and sweat. Snoring. The heavy, thick snore of a drunken man. Kalen let his eyes adjust. After a few seconds, he saw. Urga lay on hides in the center of the tent. Beside him lay one of his wives. She wasn't asleep. She sat with open eyes and looked straight at Kalen. In her gaze, there was no fear. Kalen put a finger to his lips. She nodded silently, then slowly rose and moved to the tent wall. Kalen approached Urga, set the spearhead against his throat. Urga snored. Kalen pressed. The point pricked the skin. A drop of blood. Urga opened his eyes. One eye, the right, cloudy with drink. He saw the spear at his throat, saw Kalen above him. His mouth opened. Kalen shook his head, quietly. Urga was drunk, but not stupid. He froze. His single eye darted around the tent. He saw his wife by the wall, saw that she stood calmly. He understood. Kalen told him the encampment was taken. The watches were down. His warriors slept. If he cried out, he'd die before anyone woke. Urga looked up at him. His face changed. First incomprehension, then anger, then fear, then anger again. He rasped that Kalen was a slave and that slaves don't raise weapons against masters. Kalen answered that he was no longer a slave, and Urga was no longer a master. Urga jerked, faster than Kalen expected, a drunk but trained warrior. His hand shot toward a knife beneath the hides. Kalen drove the spear in. The head passed through the throat and came out the other side. Urga wheezed. His body twitched twice, then went still. The wife by the wall did not make a sound. Kalen pulled out the spear. His hands shook. He gripped the shaft until his knuckles whitened. He forced himself to breathe. He went out of the tent. Outside stood Theo. Behind him, Goran with 4 fighters. Goran showed 2 fists. 10. The watch at the horses was down, the horses in place. Kalen nodded. Now. He sent Goran to the weapons pit, sent 2 to the barracks, ordered them to rouse the people, quietly, without shouting. Just open the doors and say Urga was dead. The next hour was chaos, organized chaos. Slaves came out of the barracks and didn't understand what was happening. Some fell to their knees, some wept. One ran and Marcus intercepted him. Kalen stood in the center of the encampment by the cooled sentry fire and waited. When enough people had gathered around him, he spoke, loudly and clearly. He said Urga the Crooked was dead, that his watches were down, that weapons were in the hands of slaves, that anyone who wanted to leave could leave right now. South, east, anywhere. No one would hold them. But whoever wanted to stay would stay on his terms. His terms were simple. Listen to him. Do what he says. Don't steal. Don't kill your own. Share food equally. In exchange, he would make of them people no one would ever put in a cage again. Silence. 100-some people stood in the dark and looked at a 17-year-old boy with a stranger's spear in his hand and a chief's blood on his shirt. The first to speak was Marcus. He stepped forward and stood beside Kalen, said he was going with him. Second came Goran. Third came Myra. Fourth came Theo. In silence, he just stood beside him. Then the rest followed. Not all, about 30 people separated from the crowd. They wanted to leave. South. Home. Kalen nodded. He said to take food and water for 3 days, and warned that to the south lay steppe and slaver caravans. Let them travel by night. 30 left. A little over 90 remained. Kalen looked at them. 90 ragged people in the dark. Some shivered with cold, some with fear, some with something for which there is no word. Kalen ordered Goran to hand out weapons from the pit, spears to those who could hold them, knives to all. He ordered Marcus to set a new watch from their own people, in twos, 2 hours each, changed by whistle. He ordered Myra to feed everyone, including Urga's wives and the children of the encampment. Marcus turned and asked what to do with Urga's warriors asleep in the tents. There were more than 60. They'd wake in the morning. Kalen answered that he knew. He ordered all the weapons taken from every tent while the warriors slept, quietly, spears. In the morning, 63 of Urga's warriors woke to find their weapons gone. Kalen stood in the center of the encampment with 20 of his fighters in formation, when the first of them began coming out of the tents. The formation looked imposing. 20 men shoulder to shoulder, sticks replaced with real spears from Urga's arsenal. The line even. Silence. It was a sight Urga's warriors had never seen. Slaves in formation, with weapons, silent. The first warrior who came out of a tent froze in place. The second stopped beside him. The third cursed and climbed back into the tent for weapons that were no longer there. Kalen waited until enough men had gathered in the yard. Then he spoke. He spoke in the local tongue. After a month at the encampment, his speech had grown more confident. He said Urga the Crooked was dead, that the encampment now belonged to those who lived in it, to everyone who lived in it. He said every warrior had a choice, take a horse and ride off, or stay. Whoever stayed would live by new rules, no slavery. Everyone eats the same, everyone works, everyone trains. Whoever disagreed could leave, right now. The warriors exchanged glances. They didn't understand. A boy slave stands before them and offers terms. This was beyond their picture of the world. One of the warriors stepped forward, a big man with a shaved head and a scar on his forearm. He said Kalen was a pup and that he personally would skin him. Then he stepped toward Kalen. Marcus stepped forward from the formation and stood between them. He said not a word, just stood with his spear leveled at the warrior. The warrior looked at Marcus, looked at the formation behind him, 20 spears leveled in his direction. Not one trembled. The warrior spat, then turned and walked toward the horse pen. Within an hour, 23 warriors rode off. They took horses and left to the east. Kalen did not interfere. 40 remained. 40 warriors who chose to stay. Not out of love for Kalen, out of calculation. The encampment was their home. Their families were here. Their livestock was here. There was nowhere to go. Neighboring tribes would take them in as destitute fugitives. Staying with a strong chief was more familiar than fleeing. Kalen understood this. He didn't expect loyalty from them. He expected obedience. Loyalty would come later. Or it wouldn't. The first 3 days after the uprising were the hardest, not because of external enemies, because of internal ones. 90 former slaves and 40 former warriors had to live together, eat together, work together. It was impossible. The slaves looked at their former masters with fear and hatred. The warriors looked at the former slaves with contempt. Conflicts flared every hour. One of the warriors struck a slave for carrying water too slowly. Kalen came over and stood between them. He told the warrior that here, no one strikes anyone. The warrior answered that a slave was a slave and always would be a slave. Kalen answered that here there were no slaves. There were people. And if the warrior wanted to strike someone, let him strike him. Kalen, right now. The warrior looked at him from above, a 17-year-old boy against a grown fighter. The warrior could have killed him with one blow. But behind Kalen stood Marcus, and Goran, and Theo, and 17 more men with spears who looked at the warrior without blinking. The warrior lowered his hands, stepped back. Kalen turned to the slave, said he needed to carry the water faster. Not because someone ordered it, but because the water was needed by everyone. The slave nodded and hurried on. Kalen understood that order couldn't be established by words alone. Structure was needed. He began building it from the first day. He divided the encampment into groups of 10. Each group had a leader. Among the leaders were both former slaves and former warriors. Deliberately, each 10 included both. They ate together, slept in one tent, trained together. Kalen knew that a common pot and a common enemy smooth over any hatred. Not at once, but in time. The training became daily. No longer was it necessary to hide in the ravine. Kalen led the men out to a flat field beyond the encampment and drove them from dawn to noon. Formation, step, thrust, withdraw, reform, formation again, step again. The former warriors resisted the formation most of all. They were used to fighting their own way, each for himself, bravely, furiously, senselessly. Kalen paired them with former slaves and made them move in sync. The warrior hated it. The slave was afraid. But after 10 repetitions, the warrior noticed his thrust had grown stronger because the slave beside him covered his flank. And the slave noticed his fear had grown smaller because the warrior beside him held the line. It worked. Slowly, through gritted teeth. But it worked. On the 5th day after the uprising, Kalen turned to the camp. He ordered latrine pits dug 100 paces from the dwelling tents, down the slope, downwind. The reaction was predictable. Both slaves and warriors looked at him as if he were mad. Why dig a pit if you can go behind the nearest bush? Kalen did not explain about bacteria and microbes. He said it was an order, and that whoever disobeyed would do double watch. Within a week, the pits were dug. Within 2 weeks, people had grown used to it. Within a month, the first wave of stomach fever passed them by. In the neighboring encampment, 20 people fell ill. Kalen had not one. He didn't explain why. He just said the pits were order. Order is life. Disorder is death. Marcus began repeating this phrase to his tens. Water regimen. Kalen introduced a rule. Everyone drinks 3 times a day. Morning, noon, evening. not from a common source, but from personal wineskins filled with boiled water. Myra organized the boiling at the kitchen cauldrons. At first, 2 helped her. Within a week, 6. Another week later, each 10 boiled its own water itself. Kaylin introduced wound care. Any cut is washed with boiled water and bandaged with clean cloth. Lena taught bandaging in each tent. She did it silently and methodically. Showed once. If they didn't understand, showed a second time. Didn't scold. Didn't explain. Just showed. People learned. In the second week, Kaylin chose a moment and approached Lena in the evening by the fire, sat beside her, was silent, then said he'd seen how she bandaged the wound of one of the warriors, and that her hands were better than his. Lena looked at her hands, long, thin fingers, a bowstring callus on her right forearm. She said nothing. Kaylin continued. He said he'd noticed the callus, asked whether she'd shot before. Lena was silent a long while, then answered with one word. Yes. Kaylin did not ask for details. He said that in Urga's weapon stores there were 10 bows, 7 in good condition, about 200 arrows. He needed someone who knew how to shoot and could teach others. Lena looked into the fire, then turned to him. Her eyes were different, not empty, not glassy. There was something alive in them. She said she'd show him in the morning. In the morning, Lena took a bow. She chose the shortest of the 7, strung it, checked the spring, took an arrow, stood in stance. Kaylin noticed how her body changed. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, her feet set evenly. She became a different person. She loosed the arrow, hit a post at 30 paces, dead center. Loosed a second, a bit above the first. A third, a bit below. 3 arrows in a circle the size of a palm. Marcus, standing nearby, whistled. Kaylin approached Lena, said she needed better arrows. He'd speak with Misuk about arrowheads, light ones, with a long tail for stability in flight. Lena looked at him, asked where he knew about an arrow's tail from. Kaylin answered that his mother had had a good archer in the village. Lena didn't believe him, like all the rest. But like all the rest, she didn't ask further. By the end of the second week, Lena was training 5 shooters. Within a month, there were 12. Not all hit the post at 30 paces, but all hit a man at 20. That was enough. Kaylin wasn't building an army of snipers. He was building an army that knew how to do simple things well. A month passed. The encampment was changing. Kaylin ordered the palisade around the camp reinforced. A second line of stakes set on the approaches. A shallow ditch dug before the main entrance. The warriors grumbled that this was a waste of effort, that steppe warriors don't hide behind walls. Kaylin answered that walls stand when warriors sleep, and that a warrior who sleeps soundly strikes better in the morning than a warrior who waited all night for a raid. The ditch was dug, the palisade reinforced. In the third week, the test came. A scout came running in the morning. One of the former herders Kaylin had set to watch the eastern trail. He said a detachment was moving from the east, about 30 horsemen, no banners, high speed. Kaylin asked whose. The scout didn't know. Kaylin whistled, 3 long, alarm. The encampment came into motion, not chaotic, drilled. Each 10 knew its place. Fighters with spears to the palisade, shooters to the platforms Kaylin had ordered built in the first week. Women and children to the center of the camp. Kaylin climbed onto a platform and looked east. Dust on the horizon. 30 horsemen, maybe more. In half an hour, they would be here. Beside him stood Lina with her bow. Kaylin looked at her. She drew the string and released, checking the tension. Her face was calm. Kaylin turned to Marcus, said to have the formation stand behind the palisade, not in front of it. Marcus nodded. 30 fighters with spears lined up in 2 ranks behind the palisade. The front rank, spears forward through the gaps between the stakes. The second rank, 3 paces behind the first, reserve. The horsemen drew nearer. Kaylin could see them now without the dust. Not 30, 25, mounted, with spears and axes. No bows. They rode fast, but not in attack, reconnaissance, or envoys. Or those 23 warriors who had ridden off 2 days ago and brought reinforcements. Kalen looked closer. At the head of the detachment rode a horseman on a black horse. Not one of Urga's departed warriors, someone else. Large, in a hide with red stripes. Red stripes. Kalen remembered. From his talks with Urga's former warriors, he knew that red stripes were the mark of the Red River tribe, a neighboring tribe, larger than Urga's encampment, about 200 warriors. Their chief Targan had been Urga's ally, or rather a senior partner to whom Urga paid tribute in livestock and slaves. Now Urga was dead, and one of the departed warriors had evidently reached Targan and told him the encampment had been taken by slaves. Targan had sent reconnaissance. The 25 horsemen stopped 100 paces from the palisade. The horseman on the black horse rode forward. He looked at the palisade, at the platforms, at the spears jutting from behind the stakes, at the shooters. Kalen saw his face change. He had expected to see a huddle of terrified slaves. He saw a fortified camp and a formation. The horseman shouted, asked who the chief was. Kalen stepped to the edge of the platform, stood so he could be seen. A 17-year-old boy in a dirty shirt with a spear. Not an impressive sight. But behind him stood Lena, with a bow and an arrow on the string. The horseman asked what had happened to Urga. Kalen answered that Urga was dead. The horseman asked who killed him. Kalen answered that he did. The horseman was silent, then asked who Kalen was. Kalen answered that he was the one who stood behind this palisade. The horseman smirked, then turned his horse and rode off. All 25 rode off. Kalen stood on the platform and watched them go. Marcus climbed up to him, said they would come back. Not 25, more, much more. Kalen nodded. He knew. He had maybe 2 weeks, maybe less. 2 weeks to turn 130 people, half of whom had been slaves yesterday, and the other half their masters yesterday, into a force capable of repelling an attack by 200 horsemen. He came down from the platform, looked at Marcus, said they needed to talk about Abatis. Marcus asked what Abatis was. Kalen allowed himself a second smirk in the last month, then began to explain. Abatis was a simple thing. Felled trees laid crosswise, branches outward. Branches sharpened with an axe, a strip 5 paces wide. A horse can't pass through such a thing. A man on foot can pass, but slowly, and a slow man on foot is a target. Kalen explained the principle to Marcus in 10 minutes. Marcus understood in 5. A sergeant who had built camps for the Alderan infantry for 20 years knew what a field fortification was. He'd simply never seen it done this way. Not around the whole camp. Only on 3 sides. The eastern side, the northern side, the southern side. The western Kalen left open. Marcus asked why. Kalen answered that the enemy must see an exit. If you surround yourself completely, the enemy will attack from all sides at once. But if you leave one side open, the enemy will go there, because it's easier, because it's obvious. And it's there that Kalen would set the ambush. Marcus looked at him for 5 heartbeats, then said it was the dirtiest tactic he'd heard in his life. Kalen answered that dirty is when 200 horsemen hack down 100 men on foot in an open field. And what he was doing was sense. The work began at once. Everyone in the encampment worked. Fighters and non-fighters, men and women, former slaves and former warriors. Kalen himself hauled logs. His thin body trembled under the weight, but he didn't stop. The people saw this. A boy commander who didn't hide behind others' backs. It worked better than any order. Trees were felled in a grove beyond the ravine. 20 men cut, 20 hauled, 20 laid them out and sharpened the branches. The rest deepened the ditch and built up the palisade. In 4 days, the abatis line was ready. 3 sides of the camp closed. The western, open. But not quite. Kalen walked the western slope and found what he was looking for. 2 shallow ravines on either side of the trail. about 50 meters from the palisade, deep enough for 10 men to lie in each, close enough to strike the flank of anyone running along the trail toward the open gate. He placed Goran there, with a 10 in the left ravine. In the right, he placed a 10 of Urga's former warriors under a man named Darg. Darg was one of the 40 who'd stayed. Not young, silent, with heavy hands and a slow gaze. He didn't like Kalen, but he'd seen the formation and the abatis, and he understood the boy knew what he was doing. That was enough. Kalen gave Goran and Darg identical instructions. Lie quiet. Don't move until the enemy passes. Wait for the signal. 3 long whistles. After the signal, rise and strike the back. Not the flank, the back. Goran asked what if the enemy didn't run to the western gate. Kalen answered that he would, because 3 walls of abatis and spears behind a palisade on 3 sides would leave him no choice. Kalen looked at the sky, the 5th day. Targan's reconnaissance had been here 3 days ago. A messenger needed a day to reach the Red River encampment. Targan needed a day to gather his men, another day to march. So the earliest was tomorrow, the latest in 3 days. He guessed right. They came on the 6th day after the reconnaissance. Early morning, fog. A scout came running when the sky had only begun to gray in the east. He said he'd seen fires on the plain. Many fires. Kalen climbed onto a platform. Fog lay across the steppe in a milky blanket. Through it broke orange points. Campfires. He counted. 20 fires. If each fire had 5 to 10 men, that was from 100 to 200. Most likely closer to 200. Targan had brought everything he had. 3 short whistles. Alarm. The camp woke and came into motion. Each knew his place. Drilled. Hammered into the muscles by a week of daily training. 30 fighters with spears to the palisade on the eastern side. 20 distributed across the northern and southern. 12 shooters on the platforms. Goran and Darg with 20 already in the ravines on the western side. They'd gone there in the night, waiting. Misuk had handed out the last arrowheads the evening before. 60 spears with iron heads. Identical. Standard. Each head fit any shaft. Misuk hadn't slept for 2 days to finish. When Kalen came to her the day before, she sat by the anvil and couldn't lift the hammer. Her hands wouldn't obey. Kalen took her by the wrist and turned her palm up. Fresh burns over old ones. She pulled her hand back, said everything was fine. Kalen didn't argue. He called Lena and asked her to bandage the master's burns. Misuk looked at him as he left. He'd called her master, not slave, not smith, master. Now she stood by the forge with a hammer in her hand and looked east, ready to forge arrowheads if the battle dragged on. The fog began to lift around noon, and Kalen saw them. Not 200, 180, maybe 190. It was hard to count exactly because they moved not in formation but in a crowd. A huge crowd of riders and men on foot, about 70 mounted, the rest on foot. At the front on a black stallion rode Targan himself. Kalen recognized the red stripes on his hide. Targan was a massive man with long black hair braided into 3 plates. He halted his host 200 paces from the palisade, looked at the fortifications for a long while, at the abatis line, at the spears behind the stakes, at the shooters on the platforms, then rode forward and shouted. He demanded that Urga's killer come out and accept death. Then the rest would live. They would be made slaves again, but living slaves. Kalen stood on the platform. He did not answer. Targan waited, shouted again, the same words. Kalen was silent. Targan waited another minute, then turned to his men and raised his spear. The attack began from the eastern side, as Kalen had foreseen. The east was the widest side, and Targan threw his main forces there. About 100 men on foot ran toward the palisade with a cry. They ran in a wide, ragged wave, each on his own. Each chose his own target. The cry was deafening. Kalen saw some of his fighters behind the palisade go pale. Former slaves who 2 months ago had themselves trembled with fear at the sight of one warrior with a spear, and now 100 ran at them. Kalen shouted one word, formation, and they stood. Spears forward through the gaps in the palisade, a line, an even line. Not perfect, but even. The wave of Targan's warriors crashed into the Abbatee's line. The first ranks ran onto the sharpened branches. 2 fell impaled on stakes. The rest slowed, began climbing over, tangling in the branches, shoving each other. The formation broke instantly. Those running behind pressed on those stuck in front. A crush. Shouts. Kalen raised his hand, lowered it. Lena and 12 shooters loosed arrows. The first volley. At a range of 20 paces, into the crowd stuck in the Abbatees. To miss was impossible. 8 arrows found their marks. 8 warriors fell. The second volley. 6 more. The third. 5. Targan's warriors tried to fight through the abattis under a hail of arrows. Some succeeded. They reached the palisade, met the spears. 30 spears striking at the same time through the gaps between the stakes. Not one of Targan's warriors knew what to do with this. They were used to close combat, to single combat, to the duel. A wall of spears gave no duel. It gave only death. The first wave rolled back after 15 minutes. On the abattis line and before the palisade lay bodies. Kalen counted, about 30, maybe 35. He had no losses, not one. Targan regrouped, sent a second wave, this time from the north. 50 warriors. The result was the same. The abattis slowed them, the arrows thinned them, the spears behind the palisade stopped them. Another 20 bodies on the field. Kalen had 3 wounded, not 1 killed. Targan stood on his horse 200 paces off and watched. He didn't understand what was happening. His warriors were dying, and these slaves behind sticks wouldn't even come out into the field. It was against the rules. It was wrong. It was insulting. Kalen stood on the platform and waited. He knew what Targan would do next. Targan looked at the 3 sides: abattis, palisade, spears, arrows. Then he looked west, the open side, the trail to the ravine. No abattis, no hitch. The gate flung open. Targan wheeled the cavalry around, 70 horsemen, he himself at their head. They circled the encampment in a wide arc and struck from the west, along the open trail, into the open gate, exactly where Kalen had directed them. The cavalry rushed forward with a cry, 70 horses in a cloud of dust, Targan in front, spear leveled. They flew past the ravines, 50 paces, 40, 30. Kalen raised the reed pipe and whistled. 3 long whistles. Goran rose from the left ravine, Darg from the right. 20 men stood and struck the flanks of the cavalry at the same time. Spears into the sides of the horses. Horses fell. Riders flew over their heads. Hooves churned the fallen. The cavalry collapsed in on itself. The front couldn't stop. The rear pressed on. The shooters on the platforms shifted their fire west. Arrows flew into the backs of the riders. Targan wheeled his horse. He saw what had happened, saw the men from the ravines, understood it was a trap. His face twisted. He raised his spear and rushed at Goran. Goran met him with an upward thrust. The spear went into the horse's side. The horse reared. Targan stayed in the saddle. Turned, swung his axe. Ren, standing behind Goran, stepped forward and struck Targan with his spear in the thigh. Targan dropped the axe, clutched his leg. Another spear went into his back. He fell from the horse. On the ground, they finished him. Quickly, without cruelty, without triumph. The cavalry scattered, without a chief, without direction, without formation. Riders fled in all directions, some back along the trail, some into the steppe. Some threw down their weapons and fell to their knees. The men on foot, still standing on the field, saw the cavalry broken and the chief dead. They ran. Not all at once. First the rear ranks, then the middle, then the front. Within 10 minutes, the field was empty. Only bodies and abandoned weapons. Kalen came down from the platform. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat on the ground and leaned his back against the palisade. His hands shook. His whole body shook. The adrenaline was draining and leaving emptiness. Beside him sat Marcus, also silent. Then Lena came up. She sat on the other side. Her hands were shaking too. Her fingers were torn by the bowstring to the blood. She'd loosed more than 40 arrows in the battle. They sat, the three of them, in silence. Then Marcus said Kalen had been right. Kalen asked about what? Marcus answered, about everything. The rumor spread faster than Kalen had expected. 3 days after the battle, a caravan of 6 wagons came up to the encampment. Slavers of the Grey Belt. They were heading to Urga as usual. They'd brought 12 new slaves in a cage, iron in ingots, cloth, salt. The caravan master dismounted at the gate and saw the palisade and the abattis line and the platforms and a formation of 20 fighters standing at the entrance. He didn't ask questions, turned around, got on his horse, and rode off. He left the wagons. Kalen ordered the cage opened. 12 people, just like him 2 months ago. Gaunt, with marks of beatings, with eyes in which there was nothing but fear. He stood before them and knew that each of them saw before them a 17-year-old stranger with a spear. Not a savior, another master. He said to them the same thing he said to everyone. You can leave, you can stay. Whoever stays will eat and work and train on equal footing with everyone. 10 stayed, 2 left. Kalen did not consider this a victory. He counted people. Now he had about 160 people. Of them, 70 fit to fight, 30 in training. The rest, women, children, old people, and wounded. The iron from the caravan Kalen gave to Misuk, 3 ingots. Her eyes lit up when she saw the metal. She said 40 arrowheads would come of it if she economized, or 20 good knives, or 10 arrowheads of a new type. Kalen said he needed everything. Misuk looked at him, then said she needed a second hearth and 2 more helpers. Not the dullards who worked the bellows, but people who could hold a blank. Kalen nodded. He brought her 2. A former warrior of Urga's named Kren, whose hands were strong enough and obedient enough. And Myra. Myra was surprised. She asked why a cook should go to the forge. Kalen answered that she didn't need to forge. She needed to organize the process. Coal, water, blanks, order. Myra knew how to count and how to give orders. A forge needs not only a hammer, a forge needs order. Myra looked at Misuk. Misuk shrugged. Within a week, the forge worked in 2 shifts. Misuk forged by day, Kren and a second helper forged by night under her supervision. Myra kept account of every piece of iron, every arrowhead, every knife. Kalen came every evening and looked at the records. Myra didn't write. She couldn't. She counted with notches on a stick. 1 notch, 1 arrowhead. 2 notches, a knife. Kalen thought he needed to teach her to write, then thought that first he needed to learn to write in this language himself. The stranger's memory gave him the spoken tongue, but not letters. That was for later. Right now, there were more important matters. In the second week after the battle, refugees came to the encampment. 7 people, 3 men and 4 women. They were from a small encampment a day's travel to the north. Their encampment had been ravaged by a detachment from the east. Not a tribe, bandits. Former warriors from various tribes who'd banded together into a gang and robbed small encampments. The refugees had heard that in the place of Urga's encampment, there was now a different chief, Young, who didn't kill prisoners and gave out food. They came empty-handed and asked for shelter. Kalen took them in. 3 days later, 12 more came from another encampment. The same story. Bandits, hunger, rumors of a young chief. Kalen took everyone in, fed everyone, gave everyone a place in a tent, put everyone in a 10. By the end of the 3rd month, his encampment had grown to 200 people. He could no longer call it an encampment, it was a camp. Marcus proposed building new tents beyond the palisade. Kalen refused. He said the camp needed to be expanded, a new perimeter, a new palisade, new abattis, bigger, deeper. Marcus asked where to get logs. They'd already cut down half the grove beyond the ravine. Kalen answered that he knew. A different grove was needed. Reconnaissance was needed. They needed to know what was around. He called Lena, said he needed scouts, people who could move quietly and look carefully. Lena nodded. She chose 5 of her shooters, the fastest and quietest. Within a week, Kalen had a map. Not a real map on paper, there was no paper. A map of stones and sticks on the ground by his tent. Each stone a place, a ravine, a hill, a grove, a stream, a trail, an encampment. Lena and her scouts went around 2 days' travel in each direction. They found 3 groves, 2 streams flowing into a river in the south, 4 abandoned encampments, and tracks, fresh tracks of a large detachment on the eastern trail. Not bandits, an organized host, many horses. Lena said the tracks led south. Kalen asked how many. Lena answered, no fewer than 500. Kalen squatted before his map of stones. 500. That's not a neighboring tribe. That's something bigger. He remembered the talk he'd heard from Urga's former warriors, a name they spoke quietly and with a glance over the shoulder. Garok the Black Bull, chief of chiefs of the Bone Hills, a man who united tribes, a man who was gathering an army. Kalen asked Marcus what he knew about Garok. Marcus knew little. Rumors. Garok had united a dozen tribes east of the Bone Hills. His army was growing. He demanded tribute from minor chiefs. Those who didn't pay, he destroyed. Urga had paid. Targan had paid. Now Urga was dead, and Targan was dead, and in their place an incomprehensible boy who paid no one. Kalen understood. 500 on the Eastern Trail was not a threat to him. Not yet a threat. This was Garok moving south, preparing a great campaign, gathering forces. But sooner or later, Garok would turn west and see that in Urga's former encampment, someone was building something incomprehensible. And then would come not 200, but 2,000. Kalen stood up, looked west. The hills stretched to the horizon, gray, empty, hostile. He needed more people, more weapons, more time, and allies. He turned to Marcus and said they needed to find other encampments that didn't want to pay Garok. Marcus smirked and answered that there were none. Everyone paid. Everyone was afraid. Kalen answered that then they needed to find those who paid but hated it. Those who had a reason to stop being afraid. He needed a pretext. The pretext came on its own. In the 4th month, a boy of about 12 came running into the camp, barefoot, beaten, with dried blood on his face. He collapsed at the gate and was carried to Kalen. The boy wheezed and couldn't speak. Lena gave him water. Sunya, who'd come to the camp a week ago, treated his wounds. Sunya. She needs to be spoken of separately. She came alone, at night. The sentries nearly killed her. She passed the abattis and palisade as if they didn't exist, stood before Kalen with a knife in her hand, and said she'd come to kill him. Kalen looked at her, a young woman with black hair to her waist and eyes the color of wet stone, thin, exhausted. But in her eyes burned something that made Kalen go cold. He asked what for. She answered that he was bringing war to this land, that his battles would draw Garak, that Garak would come and destroy everything left, as he'd destroyed her tribe, the Moonstone tribe. 3 years ago, Garak had slaughtered them, all of them, except her. She survived because she'd been in the forest, gathering herbs, returned to the ashes. Since then, she'd walked alone. 3 years. Kalen listened, then said that if she killed him, his people would scatter and Garak would come sooner. If she didn't kill him, let her stay. He needed a healer, not a killer. Sunye stood before him with the knife. Her hand trembled. Not from weakness, from hatred. Or from something else. She lowered the knife. Stayed. Since then, a week had passed. Sunye healed the wounded. In silence. Skillfully. Her hands knew herbs no one else in the camp knew. She stopped bleeding with a touch, and it frightened people. Kalen took 40 men with him. The best. Those who had trained from the first day. Marcus led the first 20. Goran the second. Lena went with 3 shooters in the vanguard. Reconnaissance. They set out before dawn and walked the whole day. At a quick march, not at a run. Kalen had explained the rhythm back in training. 50 paces at a quick pace, 50 at a normal one. Again, 50 quick. The body adjusts to the rhythm and doesn't tire as fast as with constant running. Urga's warriors didn't march this way. The Alderan infantry didn't march this way. No one in this world marched this way. But Kalen didn't care. He knew it worked. By sunset, they'd covered a distance the locals walked in a day and a half. Lena came back from reconnaissance and reported. Garak's collector detachment was camped a quarter-hour's travel away. 22 warriors, 5 captive women, a herd of 80 head. They weren't in a hurry, not expecting an attack. They had 4 sentries. The rest were drinking by the fire. Kalen listened, asked Lena about the terrain around the camp. Lena described it, an open clearing, a stream to the west, a small hill to the south, brush to the north and east. Kalen made his decision in a minute. Marcus with the 20 goes around from the north through the brush. Goran with 15 comes from the east. Kalen with 5 and Lena climbs the hill from the south. Shooters on the hill. Lena works the sentries first. On the signal, Marcus and Goran strike at the same time from 2 sides. Marcus nodded. Goran nodded. Lena was already checking her bowstring. They moved. The night was clear. The stars gave enough light. Kalen climbed the hill and lay down. Beside him, Lena. 2 shooters to the right, 2 to the left. Below on the clearing, 3 fires burned. Around them, warriors sat and lay. Kalen counted. 18 by the fires, 4 sentries, 2 at the herd, 2 at the tent where the captives were apparently held. He waited 20 minutes, gave Marcus and Goran time to circle, then raised his hand and pointed Lena at the nearest sentry. He stood with his back to the hill, 30 paces off. Lena raised the bow, exhaled, loosed the arrow. The sentry fell without a sound. The arrow went into the base of his neck. The second sentry stood at the herd. Lena loosed a second arrow, hit him in the back. He fell to his knees, opened his mouth. No sound came out. A third arrow, the third sentry at the captive's tent, hit him in the shoulder, not fatal. The sentry cried out, not loud, but enough. One of the warriors by the fire raised his head. Kalen whistled, 3 long. From the brush to the north struck Marcus, 20 fighters in formation, a line of spears. They came out of the dark in silence, without a cry, without a roar. They simply stepped into the firelight and struck. Garak's warriors leapt up, grabbed their weapons. Half didn't make it. Marcus's spears went through the camp like a knife through bread. At the same time, Garan struck from the east, another 15 spears. Garak's warriors were caught between two lines. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Kalen counted from above. Those of Garak's warriors who managed to grab a weapon fought furiously. Each of them was stronger than any of Kalen's fighters. One of them killed 2 before 3 spears entered him at the same time. Another wounded Garan in the leg. A third broke through Marcus's line and ran toward the horses. Lena took him with an arrow on the run, 50 paces, in the dark, at a running target. The arrow went in between the shoulder blades. He fell. After 4 minutes, it was quiet. 22 of Garak's warriors lay on the ground. Not one surrendered. They fought to the last. Kalen noted this. Garak's men were different, not like Urga's warriors, not like Targan's warriors. These believed in their chief, believed truly. That made them dangerous. Kalen lost 4 killed and 6 wounded. Costly. Too costly for 22 bodies. But the 5 women were alive. They were found in the tent, bound, beaten, but alive. Lena cut the ropes. The women couldn't speak. One of them shook so hard that Lena threw her own cloak over her. Kalen approached, said they were free, that they'd be taken back to their encampment, or to his camp, wherever they wanted. They wanted to go home. Kalen nodded. In the morning, they set out back. They drove the herd of 80 head along with them. The women were carried on stretchers of spears and hides, the wounded too. The 4 dead were carried on shoulders. Kalen walked in front, in silence. The faces of those 4 stood before his eyes. He knew their names. He knew where they were from. He knew which of them had laughed at training yesterday, and which had shared water with a neighbor. 4 men he'd sent to their deaths. Marcus walked beside him. He said losses in battle were inevitable, that 4 of 40 was a good result against 22 experienced warriors. Kalen didn't answer. Marcus was right, and Kalen knew it. But the knowing didn't help. They returned to camp on the 3rd day. The boy from the ravaged encampment waited at the gate. When he saw the women, he ran to them. One of them turned out to be his older sister. He hung on her neck, and she pressed him to her, and they stood like that a long while. Kalen passed them into the camp, gave the herd to Myra, gave the captured weapons to Marcus. Axes, spears, knives, 3 bows, leather armor, everything that had been on Garak's warriors. Then went to his tent and sat on the ground, closed his eyes. 4 faces. He would remember. An hour later, Sun Ye came. She brought a hot brew, set it before him. Kalen looked at her. She said he hadn't eaten in 2 days. Kalen answered that he wasn't hungry. Sun Ye sat across from him, was silent. Then said, the shamans of her tribe said that everyone killed in battle stays beside the one who sent him, not as a curse, as a debt, and that the only way to pay this debt is to make their death mean something. Kalen looked at her. She wasn't comforting, wasn't pitying. She was telling the truth. His truth. He drank the brew. A week later came the first result of his raid. A small encampment, half a day's travel to the north, sent 2 elders. They'd heard a young chief had beaten Garak's collectors and returned the abducted women. They wanted to talk. Kalen talked. He didn't promise them protection. He couldn't protect what he couldn't control. He offered something else, an alliance. Their warriors train with his warriors. Their encampment warns him if it sees strangers. His encampment helps if they're attacked. A common enemy, a common defense. The elders exchanged glances, asked what was needed in return. Kalen answered, "Nothing. No tribute, no oath, just a word. A word that when he calls, they come, and when they call, he comes." The elders were perplexed. In their world, it wasn't done this way. A chief takes tribute. A chief demands an oath. A chief owns. This boy demanded nothing. It was incomprehensible. And the incomprehensible frightened. But it frightened less than Garok. They agreed. Within a month, 2 more encampments joined the alliance. Small ones, 30 to 40 people each. But these were people who knew the steppe, knew the trails, knew where water was and where shelter, and their warriors began coming to training. By the 6th month, the camp had changed beyond recognition. Where Urga's dozen tents had stood, there was now a fortress. Not of stone, of wood, but a fortress. A double palisade around the perimeter. An earthen rampart between the outer and inner rings. A ditch the depth of a man's height before the outer palisade. 4 platforms for shooters at the corners. 1 gate, narrow, with a turn. A horseman couldn't gallop through. A man on foot could pass only single file. Marcus looked at the fortress and shook his head. He'd served in the Alderan army 20 years and had seen nothing like it. The Alderans built square camps with gates on 4 sides. Kalen built differently. 1 gate, because 1 gate needed to be defended in 1 place, and 4 in 4. Inside the fortress, the order was iron. Tents stood in even rows. Between them, paths were trodden. Latrine pits at the western edge, downwind and down the slope. The kitchen in the center. The forge at the eastern edge, where the smoke drifted away from the dwelling tents. The infirmary beside the forge. Sunya had insisted on this. She said she needed the heat of the hearth for her bruise. Kalen suspected it wasn't only about the heat. Sunya did things he didn't understand. She laid her hands on wounds, and the wounds closed faster than they should have. She whispered over water, and the sick drank that water, and the fever fell by night. The first time he saw this, a cold sweat broke over him. Magic. Real magic. Not a trick. Not suggestion. He saw with his own eyes how a wound on Goran's forearm that should have festered for a week closed in 2 days after Sunya passed her palms over it and whispered something. Kalen came to her that evening, asked directly what she was doing. Sunya looked at him a long while, then said she spoke with the spirits of fire and water. They hear those who know how to ask. She knew how to ask. Kalen was silent. In his former life, he'd have called this nonsense. But he sat in a world where his soul lived in a stranger's body, where he'd come here from behind a steering wheel, where he remembered 2 lives at once. Who was he to call anything nonsense? He asked whether she could teach others. Sunyi shook her head. A gift, not a skill. It can't be taught. You can only be born with it. Kalen nodded, then asked whether the spirits could make war, kill. Sunyi rose sharply, her eyes darkened. She said, "The spirits heal, not kill. Whoever asks the spirits to kill stops hearing them forever. It's a law." Kalen raised his hands, said he understood. He wouldn't ask. Sunyi sat back down, was silent, then said more quietly that there were others. Shamans who speak with the spirits of earth and bone, dark spirits. They kill. And Garok shamans speak with them. Kalen memorized this. It was new, dangerous. He understood ambushes and formations and siege fortifications. He didn't understand magic, and that made him vulnerable. That night, he lay awake a long while, thinking. He'd beaten Urga because Urga was a drunken chief of a minor encampment. He'd beaten Targan because Targan threw his warriors at the abattis in a crowd. He'd beaten Garok's collectors because they hadn't expected an attack. But Garok was different. Garok united thousands. Garok had shamans who killed with magic. Garok had an iron will and the righteousness of a desperate man. Kalen needed to grow faster than he was growing. By the 6th month, he had 300 people. Of them, 120 fit to fight, 40 shooters under Lena's command, 80 spearmen under Marcus's. Marcus had accepted a rank Kalen didn't say aloud, but everyone understood. First officer, right hand. Marcus no longer asked where a village boy knew tactics from. He'd stopped asking after the battle with the Red River. Now he simply listened and did. Lena had changed. She no longer fell silent for days. She gave orders. Short, precise. Her scouts went out for 3 days and came back with information worth more than 100 spears. Kalen made her head of reconnaissance, officially, before the formation. Marcus did not object. Misuk worked. Every day. The forge never went cold. She'd found clay for crucibles on the bank of the stream and now smelted iron with additives that made the arrowheads harder. She didn't sleep for 2 days when new metal came in. Kalen came to her and stood beside her in silence. Sometimes helped work the bellows. Sometimes brought water. Once he came and saw her sitting on the ground crying. Quietly, without a sound. Tears rolled down cheeks covered in soot. He sat beside her, didn't ask, waited. She said she'd broken the die for arrowheads, a die she'd made over 5 days, and that she had no more iron for a new one. Kalen looked at the broken die, then stood and walked out. 2 hours later, he came back. With him walked Marcus and 4 fighters. They carried 3 sacks. Iron. Captured weapons from the raid that Kalen ordered melted down. 12 axes, 5 spearheads, 8 knives. All of it could be melted and reforged. Misuk looked at the sacks, then at Kalen. He said this arrowhead was for Lena, pointed at the fragment of the die. Said that Lena's bow hit at 40 paces, and she needed a light head with a long tail. Misuk wiped her face with her sleeve, nodded. That night she didn't sleep, and by morning she had a new die, better than the old one. Theo. Theo must be spoken of. Theo trained every day. He did everything he was told, stood in formation, struck on command, went on watch, carried water, was silent. He barely spoke, only yes and no and understood. But Kalen noticed that Theo had stopped staring at a single point. His eyes moved. He saw what was around him. He noticed things. Once Theo approached Kalen after training and said the third 10 reformed from line into column too slowly. Kalen looked at him. Orak didn't talk, didn't send envoys, didn't demand surrender. He simply attacked. At noon that same day. The first wave struck from the east, 300 on foot, with a cry, with a roar, with axes and spears. They ran across the open steppe toward the Abattis line. Lena and 40 shooters began working at 100 paces. Arrows flew into the crowd continuously. Lena commanded volleys. The first rank shoots, the second loads, switch. The second shoots, the first loads. A conveyor belt. The arrows mowed down the attackers. But there were too many. 300 is not 200. The front fell. The rear stepped over the bodies and ran on. They reached the Abattis, climbed over it. The arrows kept flying, but the distance shortened and the shooters began risking hitting their own behind the palisade. Lena shifted fire to the flanks, struck at those going around the Abattis at the edges. The first of Borak's warriors reached the palisade and met the formation. Marcus stood in the center. His voice was even. Hold, hold, hold. Spears jutted from behind the stakes like a hedgehog's quills. Borak's warriors hacked at the stakes with axes. The spears stabbed them through the gaps. One hacked through, leapt onto the rampart. Marcus stepped forward and struck him in the chest with a spear. The warrior fell back. Another hacked through. Theo struck him. Not clean. The head slid along the ribs. The warrior swung his axe. The man beside Theo stepped forward and took the blow on his spear shaft. The shaft cracked. Theo struck again. This time, he hit. The fight on the eastern wall lasted an hour. The wave rolled back. Before the abattis lay dozens of bodies. Kalen's losses: 7 killed, 12 wounded. Sun Ye worked in the infirmary without pause. Her hands flew over the wounds, whispered, washed, bandaged. One of the wounded had lost too much blood. Sun Ye laid her palms on the wound and closed her eyes. Kalen stood beside her and saw the blood slow. Just slow. Not stop, but it flowed quieter. The wounded man stopped screaming. His breathing evened. Sun Ye opened her eyes. They were empty for a second, then came back. She swayed. Kalen caught her by the shoulder. She pushed his hand away, said she'd manage. Moved on to the next wounded man. Borak gave them no rest. The second attack began 2 hours later, this time from 3 sides at once: east, north, south. The cavalry circled the fortress and struck from the north. 60 horsemen. They galloped at the abbey at full speed. The horses couldn't pass through the abbey, but the riders dismounted and climbed over on foot. And from the south, another 100 on foot struck the abbey while Marcus was occupied in the east. Kalen stood on the central platform and directed the battle. He saw the whole field, saw where the pressure was, saw where the line weakened. His voice went through a chain of signalers. Whistles carried across the fortress. 3 short, reserved to the north. 2 long, shooters to the south. 1 long, 1 short. Marcus shifted 10 to the southern wall. The men moved. Not fast, not perfectly, but they moved. Months of training in the ravine and on the field were imprinted in their bodies. They heard the whistle and knew what to do. They didn't need to think. The body remembered. The northern wall held. The dismounted riders were good fighters, but without horses, they lost their advantage. The abattis and palisade equalized them with the defenders. The spears behind the palisade held the line. The southern wall nearly collapsed. One stretch of palisade was weaker. It had been built last. The stakes were thinner. 3 of Borak's warriors hacked through them and burst inside. The first rushed at the platform, at Kalen. Theo stood at the base of the platform. He didn't run, didn't shout, just stepped forward and struck with his spear. The warrior parried with his axe. Theo stepped back. The warrior swung. Theo's second strike landed in the leg. The warrior fell to one knee. The man behind Theo finished him. The other 2 who'd broken through were stopped by Goran with 3 fighters. Goran fought with a bandaged shoulder. The wound from the battle with the Red River hadn't fully healed, but he stood in formation and struck like everyone. The second attack rolled back by evening. Borak had lost no fewer than 80 men in the day. Kalen had 15 killed, 23 wounded, of whom 5 gravely. The formation held. The abattis worked. The shooters worked. But the people were at their limit. At night, Kalen walked the walls, checked the watches, spoke with each 10, briefly, simply, asked how they were, asked if water was needed, if a bandage was needed, each by name, each in the eye. Marcus walked behind him, silent, watched how a boy commander did what no officer in the Alderan army did, walks to the soldiers, doesn't order, asks. They reached the southern wall. There sat Theo, alone, looking into the dark beyond the palisade. Kalen sat beside him, was silent, then said Theo had fought well today. Theo didn't answer. Kalen waited. Theo turned his head. His eyes glinted in the light of a distant fire. He said that today, for the first time, he hadn't wanted to die. Kalen looked at him. Theo said that when that warrior ran toward the platform, he thought only one thing, that if the warrior reached Kalen, they would all perish. And he didn't want them all to perish. He didn't want Goran to perish, and Marcus, and Lena, and Myra, and Misuk, and even Ren, who snored on the next bunk. He didn't want them to die. For the first time in 2 years, he wanted someone to live. Kalen said not a word, laid a hand on Theo's shoulder, held it for 5 heartbeats. then stood and walked on. In the morning, Borak attacked again, the third wave, but weaker. The men were tired. The horses were tired. There wasn't enough water. Kalen saw it from the platform. Borak's warriors moved more slowly. Their cries were quieter. The formation, if it could be called a formation. Because Borak's warriors never had a formation. They went in a crowd. A tired, angry, exhausted crowd. The abbati stopped them again. Lena's arrows thinned the ranks. The spears behind the palisade held. Borak threw the cavalry into a final attack, this time through the gate. He'd seen the western side was weaker, and the gate, though narrow, was passable. He gathered 50 horsemen and led them himself. Kalen had waited for this. Beyond the turn at the gate stood a line of 15 spearmen, dense, shoulder to shoulder, spears braced against the ground, tilted forward, a wall of iron. The cavalry flew into the turn and saw the wall of spears 10 paces off. The front horses reared. The rear crashed into the front. A crush, shouting. The shooters on the platforms worked from above, into backs, into open flanks. Borak was in front, young, strong. He broke through the first line of spears. His horse leapt over 2 bodies. Borak swung his sword. Marcus stepped aside and struck the horse in the neck with his spear. The horse crashed down. Borak flew over its head, hit the ground, got up, sword in hand. He was fast, but around him were 10 spears. He looked at them, then threw down his sword, sank to his knees. Borak was taken prisoner. When the remaining horsemen saw their commander on his knees, they turned around and left. By noon of the second day, it was quiet. The remnants of Borak's host retreated east, without a chief, without water, without half their men. They left on the field before Kalen's fortress about 270 bodies. Kalen had lost 31 men killed over 2 days. He sat on the platform and looked at the field. 31 faces, 31 names. Beside him stood Marcus, stood Lena, stood Goran with his arm in a sling, stood Theo, alive, stood Misuk with a hammer. She hadn't forged during the battle. She'd stood at the gate with a hammer and waited. If anyone broke through, she'd have struck. Kalen looked down. On the ground before the gate sat Borak, bound, guarded by 2. Borak looked up at Kalen. In his eyes was anger. After Borak's departure, Kalen had 3 months of quiet. He used every day. People came to him, not by tens, by hundreds. Rumors of the Grey Commander spread through the Bone Hills like a steppe fire. Escaped slaves came from the southern caravans. Families came from ravaged encampments. Young warriors came from minor tribes who were sick of paying tribute to Garok. Old people came who remembered the times before Garok and wanted to live out their last years in a place where there was no need to fear. By the start of the 8th month, Kalen had 600 people. Of them, 250 fit to fight. The fortress had grown threefold: a second ring of walls, a third ditch, an outer perimeter with watchtowers on 4 hills around. Misuk had expanded the forge to 3 hearths. She now had 8 helpers working, and Myra kept account on clay tablets because the notched sticks had run out. Lena commanded 60 shooters and 20 scouts. Her network of watchers covered 2 days' travel in each direction. Marcus drove the spearmen until they sweated, and for the first time in 20 years of service, admitted he saw before him an army and not a crowd with sticks. Kalen divided the host into hundreds, 300s, each under its own commander. The first 100 Marcuses, the second 100 Gorans, the third 100 Dargs. Darg surprised Kalen. A former warrior of Urga's who'd stayed out of calculation had turned into a hard, disciplined officer. He didn't love Kalen, never came to love him, but he respected order, and Kalen was order. In the 9th month, a lone rider came up to the fortress, an old man on a gray mare, unarmed, in clothing of faded hides. Around his neck hung a necklace of wolf fangs. The sentries brought him to Kalen. The old man was silent a long while, looked at Kalen, at his face, at his hands, then asked to see his neck. Kalen didn't understand. The old man repeated. Kalen unfastened the collar of his shirt and tilted his head. The old man drew the cloth aside and saw what he was looking for. On the back of Kalen's neck was a brand, a clan brand, small, burned in early childhood. Kalen knew of it, felt the scar with his fingers, but gave it no significance. Many slaves had brands. The old man saw the brand and his hands trembled. He sank to his knees. Kalen tried to raise him. The old man wouldn't rise. He said this was the brand of the Grey Wolf, the clan of chiefs, a clan that no longer existed, that Garok had slaughtered 3 years ago, all of them, except one boy who'd been sold into slavery in the South in time, to save him, so the line wouldn't end. Kalen stood and listened. The world around him was changing. The body he lived in was not the random body of a random slave. It was the body of an heir, the last heir of the Grey Wolf tribe, a tribe that had once been the strongest in the Bone Hills, before Garok. The old man said his name was Arvid. He had been an advisor to Kalen's father. He'd fled when Garok came, wandered 3 years through distant encampments, heard rumors of the Grey Commander, heard the name Kalen, came to check, and found him. Kalen sat on the ground. He needed to think. In his head, 2 lives collided head-on. Dan Shaw, a Special Forces captain from Virginia, and Kalen, son of the Grey Wolf chief. He wasn't Kalen. Not really. He'd taken a stranger's body and a stranger's name and a stranger's fate. But the brand on his neck was real, and the old man on his knees before him was real, and the people who remembered the Grey Wolf were real. He raised the old man, said he needed time. Arvid nodded and said he would wait. He'd waited 3 years. He'd wait more. Kalen went to Sunya. She sat by the infirmary drying herbs. Kalen sat beside her, was silent a long while, then said what he'd said to no one in this world. He said he was not who everyone took him for. Sunya looked at him, wasn't surprised. Kalen continued. He said he remembered another life, another world, a world without magic and without swords. Brenna came in the 11th month. One of Lena's patrols brought her, found her in the steppe, alone, mounted on a half-dead horse, in a torn leather jacket with an alderan patch on the shoulder, a scar through her left brow, a reddish braid bound with a leather strap, tall, broad-shouldered, hands strong even after 3 years of slavery. She sat before Kalen and ate, greedily, without embarrassment. Kalen didn't hurry her. When she'd finished, he asked who she was. Brenna answered briefly. Captain of the Alderan Auxiliary Cavalry, 3rd Mounted Regiment, taken captive 3 years ago. The encampment where she was held was ravaged by Garok's men a month ago. She killed a guard, stole a horse, and left. Rode west, heard of the Grey Commander. Kalen listened, then asked how old she was. 28. Then asked whether she knew how to command cavalry. Brenna gave him a long, appraising look. The look of a professional sizing up another professional. She said she'd commanded 100 horsemen in 2 border campaigns. Kalen nodded, said he had 40 horses. He needed a commander who knew mounted combat better than he did. Brenna asked how he knew she was better. Kalen answered that he'd never commanded cavalry, and she had, so she was better. Brenna snorted, then smirked, then said she'd take a look at his 40 horses. She looked. There were 38 horses. Of them, 20 fit for battle. The rest, draft animals, 25 riders. Of them, 10 could keep a seat. The rest sat astride like sacks of grain. Brenna turned to Kalen and said this wasn't cavalry. It was a disgrace. Kalen answered that this was exactly why he needed her. Brenna began work the next day. She was different from everyone Kaylin knew in this world. She was a professional, like Marcus, but sharper. Marcus was a sergeant, the backbone of an army. Brenna was an officer, the brain. She saw the battlefield the way Kaylin saw it, not formation and shield, but space and movement. The first time Kaylin unrolled his map of stones and sticks before her and showed the position of the fortress and the roads and the water sources, she was silent for 2 minutes. Then she jabbed a finger at a point southeast of the fortress, said that here, Garak would set his camp when he came. Kaylin asked why. Brenna answered, water and a flat field for cavalry and high ground for a command post. Any commander would choose this place. Kaylin looked at the point. He'd thought the same, but didn't say so, just nodded. From that moment, they began working together, every evening over the map. Marcus came and listened, sometimes added, but more often was silent. Marcus was a tactician of close combat. Brenna was a strategist. And Kaylin was the one who joined the one to the other. 3 heads, 3 sets of experience, 1 plan. By the 12th month, the plan had taken shape. Garak would come. It was a question not of if, but of when. Borak had returned to his father and told of his defeat. Garak would not forgive, could not forgive. His power rested on fear. If someone had beaten his son and gone unpunished, then Garak was weak. And a weak chief in the Bone Hills was killed by his own. But Garak was not stupid. He wouldn't throw his host at the fortress the way Borak had. He would prepare. Gather everyone. Come with such a force that no abatis and no formation would help. Callan assessed. Garak had 20,000 warriors, maybe more. Even if he brought half, that was 10,000. Against Callan's 1,000? The fortress wouldn't hold, not against such numbers. So something else was needed. A field was needed. A place where 10,000 would become 5, where cavalry couldn't deploy, where infantry couldn't flank, where 1,000 spears would stand against 5,000 and hold. Brenna showed the place on the map. 3 mounds, a day's travel east of the fortress. 3 hills standing in a triangle. Between them, a narrow valley, a bog to the south, a steep slope to the north. The only passage into the valley from the east, wide at the entrance and narrowing to the west, a funnel. Callan looked at this place and saw it. If you stood at the narrow end of the funnel, if you set abatis at the entrance, if you hid Brenna's cavalry behind the northern mound, if you placed Lena's shooters on the southern, if you arrayed Marcus's spearmen in the center, 10,000 would pour into the funnel like water into a bottleneck and would crush each other. The rear on the front, the strong on the weak. Their numbers would become their curse. Kaylin told Brenna and Marcus this was the place. Brenna nodded. Marcus looked at the map and shook his head. He said that even in a funnel, 1,000 against 10,000 was suicide. Kaylin answered that it wouldn't be 10. Garak wouldn't throw everyone in at once. Ash returned at night, quietly, as she'd left, found Kaylin in his tent over the map, sat across from him, and spoke. Alderaan knew about Kaylin. Royal intelligence had received reports from the Greybelt slavers. A baseborn man was gathering an army of slaves in the Bone Hills, smashing caravans, disrupting trade. The slaveholders had lost 3 caravans in half a year and were pressing the crown. But that was half the trouble. The second half was worse. Alderaan also knew about Garak. Knew Garak was preparing a campaign south, and the Alderaan court had split in 2. Some wanted to send an army north to stop Garak. Others wanted to wait until Garak and Kaylin destroyed each other and finish off the victor. A third force, the Order of the Silver Spear. A knightly order that served the crown but had its own interests. The order wanted Kaylin's head, not because Kaylin threatened Alderaan, but because Kaylin freed slaves. And slaves were money, and money was what the order rested on. Ash said the Order had already sent out a detachment, 12 knights, the best fighters in Alderaan, full armor, wrought iron, crossbows, war horses. They'd set out 3 weeks ago and were moving north through the Grey Belt. One purpose: to kill the Grey Commander. Kalen listened, then asked Ash how far off they were. Ash answered that if they came through the Grey Belt, it was a week, maybe a week and a half. Kalen nodded. 12 knights in full armor was not 200 savages with axes. One Alderaan knight was worth 10 steppe warriors. Wrought iron that an ordinary arrow couldn't pierce. Heavy swords that hacked wooden spears like reeds. War horses trained to trample infantry. This was a problem of a different order. He gathered a council: Marcus, Brenna, Lena, Goran, Darg, Misuk, Sunye. Laid it out. Marcus knew the order. His face went white. He said the Silver Spear weren't soldiers. They were killers in iron. He'd seen 3 knights of the Order go through a company of 50 infantry. Go through and not stop. Brenna confirmed it. She said that against armored knights, ordinary spears were useless. You needed either heavy crossbows, which they didn't have, or traps. Kalen looked at Misuk, asked whether she could make anything against armor. Misuk thought a minute, then said she could. If she had 3 days and all the iron there was, she could forge spikes, large wrought spikes with 4 points. However you throw such a spike, 1 point always sticks up. A horse steps on it and crashes down. A knight in heavy armor on the ground is a turtle on its back. Kalen smirked. He knew this principle. In his former life, it was called caltrops. The Romans had used them 2,000 years ago. He told Misuk to make as many as she could, then turned to Lena, asked whether she could find the knights before they found the fortress. Lena nodded. She'd already sent scouts south. Then Kalen looked at Sun Yi, asked whether she felt anything. Sun Yi was silent, then said quietly that she felt something, but not the knights, something else. From the east, large, dark. Garrock. Kalen closed his eyes for a second. 2 enemies at once. Knights from the south, Garrock from the east. Between them, he with 1,000 men. He opened his eyes and began to plan. The knights he met in the field, not in the fortress. 12 riders in heavy armor battering at the gates of a fortress was a nightmare. 12 riders in heavy armor on a field strewn with caltrops was a target. Lena found them in 4 days. They came along the southern trail, 12 mounted, the gleam of iron in the sun. They weren't even hiding. Why hide when you're the best fighter on this continent? Kalen went out to meet them, not with an army, with 50 spearmen and 20 shooters. Lena and Brenna with the cavalry went around. He chose the place, a narrow passage between 2 hills, a trail 5 horses wide. Beyond it, a widening, a clearing, flat in appearance. Beneath a thin layer of dust and grass were 200 of Misuk's caltrops. Kalen set the formation at the far end of the clearing, 50 spearmen, 3 ranks, visible, obvious, bait. The knight saw the formation and understood. A huddle of slaves with sticks had blocked the road. They didn't bother to think. The knight commander raised his sword and 12 horses surged forward. Through the passage, onto the clearing. The first horse stepped on a caltrop on the 10th stride. The spike pierced the hoof. The horse shrieked and crashed onto its front legs. The knight flew over its head. 100 pounds of iron struck the ground. The second horse, the third, the fourth. Horses fell one after another. The knights rolled across the ground in their armor. Some tried to get up. The armor weighed half their body. Without a horse, without speed, without momentum, they were slow, heavy, helpless. Kalen's formation moved forward. Not fast, step by step. Spears forward. A knight on the ground is a powerful target, but a slow one. 2 spearmen held him at distance with spears, while a third came in from the side and struck a gap in the armor. Under the arm, the hip joint, the visor. Lena's shooters worked from the hills. Not at the knights, at their horses, at those who hadn't yet entered the clearing. A horse without a rider is no threat. A rider without a horse in heavy armor is no danger. The fight lasted 20 minutes. 9 knights were killed. 2 surrendered. 1 fled. He got away through the passage on a wounded horse. Lena saw him, but didn't shoot. Kaelin ordered him let through. Let him return to Alderaan. Let him tell. Kaelin's losses came to 7 killed and 14 wounded, costly for 12 men. But each of those 12 was worth 10. And now Kaelin had 2 captive knights and 11 suits of armor. Misuk looked at the armor and her eyes burned. Wrought iron of such quality she'd never seen. She said 300 arrowheads could be made of this, or 50 helmets, or 20 breastplates. Kaelin said helmets, for the front rank. Those who stand in front must survive. Misuk nodded and carried the armor off to the forge. The 2 captive knights Kaelin placed in a tent under guard, fed them like his own. 3 days later, he came to talk. They were astonished. A slave who'd beaten the Order's knights and fed prisoners hot gruel. They didn't understand. Kaelin asked them about Garok. They knew little. Garok was gathering a host, 20,000, preparing a campaign south in the spring. Alderaan knew of it but wasn't preparing. The king was old and ill. The heirs were fighting over the throne. No one cared about the borders. Kaelin listened and thought. In the spring. He had 4 months left. 4 months. Kaelin used every day as if it were his last. The army grew. It was not only refugees who came to him. Whole tribes came. Elders of the Grey Wolf. Those who remembered his father. Those who saw the brand. Yuna came among the refugees in the 14th month. A quiet girl of 16 with a long black braid. She didn't speak for the first 3 days, sat by the fire and looked at the flames. Then she came up to Kaelin, looked at him, a long while. Then said she remembered him, a small boy who chased goats by the lower stream. She remembered his face, his real face, the face that was before slavery and before the beatings and before the scars. Kaelin looked at her and didn't know what to say. She remembered a boy he had never been. Yuna said one more thing. She said she knew the names, all the names of the dead of the Grey Wolf. The mothers had taught her to memorize them. Names are the last thing that remains of the dead. If the names are forgotten, the dead die a second time, forever. Kaelin called Myra, asked for clay tablets and a stylus. Yuna dictated for 3 days, 247 names, men, women, children, old people. Kaelin wrote down each one. His hand trembled on the last 10. When they finished, he took the tablets and carried them to the central tent, set them on a dais, said that here they would be kept, always. Yuna stood beside him and did not weep. She had stopped weeping 3 years ago, but her eyes were alive. For the first time in 3 years, there was something in them besides memory. There was purpose. Kaelin treated her like a sister. It was a conscious decision. Yuna was a bridge between him and a heritage he hadn't earned, but bore. She'd kept the secret of the brand for half a year before Arvid came. She knew before everyone, and was silent, because she saw that Kaelin was building exactly the thing for the sake of which her mothers had taught her to memorize names. A place where people are not forgotten. 4 months of preparation, every day training from dawn to noon. The spearmen learned to stand in 4 ranks. The first rank, spears forward. The second rank, spears over the shoulders of the first. The third rank, reserve. The fourth rank, replacement for the wounded. Rotation. Every 15 minutes of battle, the first rank falls back and becomes the fourth. The second becomes the first. Fresh hands, fresh eyes. No one in this world did this. Not Alderaan, not the tribes. Marcus drilled the rotation to automatism. His voice went hoarse by the end of the first week and never recovered. Brenna trained the cavalry. 60 horsemen, not many, but each could turn in the saddle and strike with a spear at a full gallop. Brenna drove them every day for 3 hours. They fell, got up, fell again. She spared no one, neither herself nor them. Once Kaelin came to the cavalry field and saw Brenna standing over a map alone. Late evening. Everyone had gone. She traced lines with her finger, and her lips moved soundlessly, replaying the battle in her head. Kaelin sat beside her, was silent. Brenna didn't turn. She said that in captivity for 3 years, she'd considered herself dead. Not physically, inside. An officer who'd lost her men and fallen into slavery is not an officer. She's garbage. So she'd thought for 3 years. Kaelin listened. Brenna turned to him, said he'd given that back to her. Kaelin asked what exactly. Brenna answered with one word. The right. The right to command. The right to decide. The right to be who she'd been before captivity. Kaelin answered that he hadn't given it back. She'd taken it herself. He'd simply not gotten in the way. Brenna looked at him a long while, then turned back to the map. But Kaelin noticed her pass a hand quickly over her eyes. Lena prepared the shooters, 120 bows. She found a way to make arrows faster. Misuk forged light heads to a standard. The shafts were cut to a template, the fletching from goose feathers that the boys gathered at the river. A conveyor belt. Lena brought production up to 50 arrows a day. By the start of spring, she had a stock of 3,000 arrows, 25 per shooter. That would last for an hour of battle, maybe an hour and a half. 3 mounds. Dawn. Fog rose from the bogs to the south and lay across the valley between the hills. Kaelin stood on the western ridge and looked east. His army had already taken its positions. Marcus with 1,000 spearmen in the center of the valley. 4 ranks, formation dense. Spears forward. Shields of boards bound with leather. Not knightly shields, but better than nothing. Lena with 120 shooters on the southern mound, hidden behind rocks, invisible from below. Brenna with 60 horsemen behind the northern mound, also invisible. Gorin with 500 in the second line, 300 paces behind Marcus, reserve. Darg with another 500 on the western ridge, the last line. Abydus blocked the valley from edge to edge, 2 strips, the first at the entrance to the funnel, the second 100 paces behind it. Between the Abydus, a strip of caltrops. Misuk had forged them for 2 weeks, 500 of them. Sun Ye stood beside Kaelin. Her eyes were closed. She breathed slowly and evenly. Beside her, the air seemed warmer. Kaelin looked at her. She opened her eyes, said she felt them. 3 shamans. They were coming with Garok. They'd already begun speaking with the spirits of bone. Kaelin nodded, asked whether she was ready. Sun Ye didn't answer, just closed her eyes again. Kaelin turned east, dust on the horizon. Garok was coming. Kaelin came down from the ridge and walked along the formation. 1,000 faces. He didn't know all the names, but he knew many. Here was Marcus, straight back, spear in hand like an extension of his body. Beside him, Theo. Thin, straight, eyes clear, no emptiness. Beside him, Goran, with a bandaged shoulder he'd refused to spare. Beside him, Ren, who'd come in a cage and now commanded a 10. Beside him, dozens of people whose faces he remembered from Urga's barracks, from ravaged encampments, from slaver caravans, former slaves, former warriors, former nobodies, now standing in formation, with spears, with shields, in helmets Misuk had forged from knight's armor. Kaelin made no speech. He walked along the formation and looked each man in the eye. That was enough. They knew why they stood here. Not for him, for themselves, so that they would never again find themselves in a cage. He came back to the command hill. Yuna stood beside him. She shouldn't have been here. Kaelin had ordered her to stay in the fortress with the baggage train. She hadn't obeyed, came in the night, stood beside him and said that if the Grey Wolf died today, she had to see, to remember, to tell. Kaelin didn't argue. Garrock's army appeared an hour after dawn, 20,000. They filled the eastern horizon from edge to edge, mounted in front, on foot behind them, banners with a black bull, and in the center, on a huge black stallion, Garrock the Black Bull. Kaelin saw him through a spyglass Misok had assembled from 2 lenses traded from an Alderan merchant. A massive man past 50, broad shoulders, shaved head, a scar across his whole face, eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing. Garrock halted his host at the entrance to the valley, looked at the abattis, at the spears behind them, at the mounds on either side. He was not stupid. He saw the trap. Kaelin knew he would see it. The question was whether he would enter. Garrock sent in the first 1,000, on foot. They went to the abattis in a dense crowd. A cry, a roar, axes and spears. The first strip of abattis slowed them. The caltrops between the strips took their harvest. Dozens fell clutching their feet. The second strip of abattis stopped the rest. And then Lena's shooters spoke. From the southern mound, from above, into the crowd stuck between the 2 strips of abattis, arrows flew continuously. The first rank shot, the second loaded. Switch! A conveyor belt of death. The first 1,000 rolled back in 15 minutes. More than 200 bodies remained on the field. Garrock sent the second 1,000. The same story. Abatis, caltrops, arrows, Marcus's spears behind the second strip. The second 1,000 lost 150 and retreated. The third 1,000, the fourth. Garrock threw wave after wave. Each wave passed a little farther. The abatis broke. The caltrops were ground into the earth. Bodies filled the gaps. By noon, the first strip of abatis was destroyed. Marcus's formation stood behind the second. 5 hours of battle. Marcus rotated the ranks every 15 minutes. Fresh hands, fresh eyes. It worked. His men held. But the arrows were running out. Lena sent a messenger to Kaelin. 5 arrows left per shooter. Another half hour of work. Maybe less. Kaelin made a decision. Sent a messenger to Goran. Reserve forward. 500 fresh spearmen moved to Marcus's formation and stood behind it. Marcus pulled his 1,000 back 100 paces. To rest. To drink water. To bandage wounds. Goran took up the battle. His men were less experienced, but they were fresh, and the formation held. Then Garrock did the thing Kaelin had been waiting for. He threw in the cavalry. 5,000 mounted, himself at their head. They went around the abattis along the edge of the valley, where the bog left a narrow strip of dry ground. Garrock knew about this strip. His scouts had found it. Kaelin knew too. He'd left this passage open, deliberately. Garrock's cavalry flew into the valley from the south side and struck the left flank of Goran's formation. The formation bent. Goran shouted. His voice cut through the roar of battle. Hold! The formation straightened, but the cavalry pressed. 5,000 mounted against 500 on foot. Even a formation won't hold. Kaelin raised his hand. The reed pipe. 1 long whistle and 3 short. The signal for Brenna. Behind the northern mound, the earth rumbled. 60 of Brenna's horsemen flew out from behind the hill at a full gallop. Not head-on, into the flank, into the right flank of Garrock's cavalry, which had bunched up at the passage and couldn't deploy. Brenna struck at full speed, spear forward. Behind her, 60 spears. The blow was like a hammer on an anvil. Garrock's cavalry crumpled. The front riders flew from their horses. The rear crashed into the front. A crush. Horses in the bog, shouting. At that moment, Sun Ye cried out. Kaelin turned to her. Her face was white. She fell to her knees and pressed her hands to her temples. Garrick shamans had struck. Kalen saw nothing, heard nothing, but he felt it. Cold. A deep, irrational cold in his chest. Fear. Not his fear, a stranger's, imposed. He saw below in the valley Goran's formation waver. The fighters of the front rank shrank back. One threw down his spear, a second. Panic began eating at the formation like acid. Sun Ye raised her head. Her eyes were fully white. She spread her arms wide and cried out, not in words, in sound. A pure high sound that passed through the valley like a wave. And with the sound came light. Small fires. Hundreds of small orange fires flared above the valley. They hung in the air like fireflies. They moved, circled, descended toward the formation. The cold in Kalen's chest receded, sharply, as if someone had opened a door and let in warmth. Below, the formation stopped shrinking back. The fighters raised their spears, gripped their hands on the shafts. The fires circled over their heads and the fear left. Sun Ye collapsed. Kalen caught her. She was unconscious. But the fires didn't go out. They burned on their own. The spirits of fire and water. They had come and stayed. Kalen laid Sun Yi on the ground. Yuna knelt beside her and took her head onto her lap. Kalen stood, looked at the field. The formation held. Brenna was breaking Garak's cavalry. Lena was loosing her last arrows. Garak broke through the melee and drove his horse toward the center of the valley, toward the command hill, toward Kalen. Beside him galloped his personal guard, 20 of the best warriors. They went through the remnants of Goron's formation like a knife through butter. Goron tried to stop them and took an axe blow to the side, fell. His own men caught him. Garak drove up the slope, toward the hill. Kalen looked down, 300 paces, 200. Between him and Garak stood Darg with the last 500. Darg arrayed a formation, 4 ranks, spears forward, in silence, without a cry. Garak crashed into Darg's formation at a full gallop. 2 of his guards fell in the first second. The formation took the blow and bent, but did not break. The spears worked. The guards fell one after another, but Garak hacked through. His huge axe shattered spears like splinters. He killed 4 with one swing. Kalen watched. Garak drew nearer, 200 paces, 150, 100. Kalen raised his spear, came down from the hill. Marcus saw it and shouted. Kalen didn't turn. He walked toward Darg's formation, stood in the first rank, beside Darg. Darg looked at him, said nothing, just shifted aside and made room. Marcus came running a minute later, stood to Kalen's right. Theo stood to Darg's left. They stood in the first rank, the commander and his men. Garak saw them. His eyes found Kalen. He recognized him, a thin boy with a spear, the Gray Commander. Garak raised his axe and struck at the formation. Kalen took the blow on his spear shaft. His hands buzzed from the force of the blow. The shaft cracked. Kalen stepped back a pace. Marcus stepped forward and struck Garak in the side with his spear. The head slid along the leather armor. Garak turned to Marcus, swung. Theo struck him from behind in the leg. Garak staggered, fell to one knee, rose. His eyes burned. He was wounded and surrounded and alone. His guard lay around him, but he didn't surrender. He raised his axe and came at Kalen. An arrow went into him under the left eye, quietly, almost soundlessly. Garak froze. His hand with the axe hung in the air. Then he fell, face into the earth, heavily. Finally, Kalen turned his head. On the southern mound, 300 paces off, stood Lena. Bow lowered, the string still trembling. She'd waited for him a full day. Lay behind a rock, didn't move, didn't eat, didn't drink. Waited for the moment. And the moment came. One shot, 300 paces, into the gap between helmet and collar, under the left eye. Garok's army saw their chief fall. The banner of the Black Bull crashed down. A cry rolled across the field. Not a battle cry, a cry of horror. Thousands of men who had followed one man saw that this man was no more. They ran, not all at once, but a wave of panic rolled from the center to the edges. First the rear ranks ran, then the middle, then the front. Brenna's cavalry finished off those who still resisted. Within an hour, the field was empty. Only bodies. Thousands of bodies. Kalen stood beside Garok's body, sank to his knees, closed the man's eyes with his hand. His palm settled on the cold face. He sat like that a minute, maybe two, then rose. Sunye stood behind him, pale, barely on her feet. Yuna supported her by the elbow. Lena came up, came down from the mound, bow on her back, hands torn by the string, face calm. Brenna rode up on horseback, the horse lathered, blood on her cheek, not her own. Marcus limped toward them from the formation, spear as a crutch. Theo walked beside him, whole, alive. Goran lay on a stretcher, breathing, a wound in his side, but Sun Ye said he'd live. Misuk came out from behind the baggage wagons with a hammer in her hand. She hadn't fought. She'd stood by the baggage the whole battle, ready. Ash brought the first prisoners, chiefs of small tribes who'd come with Garok, on their knees, hands behind their heads, awaiting death. They all stood around Kalen, his people, everyone who'd reached this day. Kalen looked at the captive chiefs. They awaited his word. He could execute them, could make them slaves, could trade them for ransom. All of that would have been understandable and familiar for this world. Kalen said one phrase, quietly, so that only the front ranks heard. Raise them up. Give them water. Tomorrow I'll tell them what we're building. Lena looked at him. He turned to her, and she saw that he was smiling, tired, covered in a stranger's blood, with a broken spear in his hand, but smiling. For the first time in 2.5 years. Because he hadn't won the war. He'd ended it. The field of 3 mounds slowly emptied. The living carried away the dead. The wounded hobbled to the baggage train. Sun Ye walked among them and touched foreheads and whispered. And the fires still burned above the valley, dimming, fading, but burning. On the western ridge, Kalen sat on the ground. Beside him sat Lina. Beside him stood Marcus. Beside him, Brenna dismounted and sat with her hands on her knees. Beside him, Theo. Beside him, Yuna. Beside him, Misuk lowered her hammer to the ground, and for the first time in a day, unclenched her fingers. Beside him, Ash, who'd been silent a whole hour, and that was a record. Beside him, Sun Ye, who came last and lay on the grass and closed her eyes. They sat on the hill and watched the sunset. On the horizon, 4,000 spears stood in a square, even ranks, silence. Above them rose a banner Yuna had sewn 3 nights ago. Not a beast, not a crown. A gray circle on a white cloth. The sun threw smoke. Kalen looked at this banner and thought about what tomorrow would bring. Tomorrow, the captive chiefs would hear his terms. No tribute, no slavery. An alliance of equals. A common council. A common defense. The same laws for all. Every voice heard. They wouldn't understand. Not at once. Maybe never. But their children would understand. Or the children of their children. It didn't matter. What mattered was to begin. Marcus sat beside him and looked at the field, then said quietly that someday he'd ask Kalen who he really was. Kalen answered that someday he'd tell. Marcus nodded. Lena sat on the other side. She said nothing, just took his hand. Her fingers were hard from the bowstring and torn to the blood. His fingers were calloused from the spear. They sat like that and were silent. And it was enough. Far to the south, in the throne hall of Alderaan, the surviving knight of the silver spear stood before the king. Beside him stood a messenger who'd ridden 3 days without stopping from the northern border. The messenger laid a map on the table. On the map, new borders were marked in red lines. Territory that 2 years ago hadn't existed. He said that in the north there was now a power to be reckoned with. The messenger said it had a name. The king asked what. The messenger answered, "The Grey Alliance." The king looked at the map a long while, then raised his eyes and asked who commanded them. The knight of the silver spear answered, "A former slave, a boy, 17 years old, who builds a state from nothing and for whom the word slave does not exist." The king leaned back in his chair. The throne hall was silent. Beyond the window, the sun was setting, the same as the one setting now over the field of 3 mounds, over 4,000 spears, over the gray circle on the white banner, over Kalen and his people, who sat on the hill and looked at the world they had built, out of mud, out of chains, out of hatred, and which was only beginning.